On the afternoon of the 10th of June, 1871, a defense attorney named Clement Vallandigham was sitting inside a courtroom in Lebanon, Ohio. He was listening to a prosecutor question a witness on the stand. And with every single word this witness spoke, Clement could feel the knot in his stomach twist and tighten just a little bit more. This testimony was not just bad, it was devastating for Clement's client, a man named Thomas McGahan, who was on trial for murder. The murder itself had happened about 6 months earlier on a cold Christmas Eve in the nearby city of Hamilton. That night, McGahan had apparently stormed into a saloon with a group of his friends. Their target was another man inside named Tom Myers. An attack broke out, it was loud, it was chaotic, and in the middle of all the shouting and shoving, a single gunshot rang out. When the chaos finally died down, Tom Myers was on the floor, shot and killed. Now, the problem was, there were at least 30 other people in that saloon at the time. But the fight had happened so fast and it was so confusing that not a single person could say for sure that they saw who actually fired the gun. Despite this complete lack of a direct witness to the shooting, almost everyone in town immediately decided that Thomas McGahan had done it. And to be fair, even Clement had to admit that it was a reasonable assumption to make. You see, McGahan and the victim Tom Myers had a very long and very public history of not liking each other. It was a well-known feud, and everybody in town knew they hated each other. On top of that, McGahan had a reputation. He was known as a violent criminal, and there were rumors, whispers that he had already killed at least 4 other men in his lifetime. So, when Tom Myers ended up dead after a fight with McGahan, the citizens of Hamilton didn't really feel the need to wait around for a trial. They were ready to form a mob and hang McGahan right then and there. Of course, the local police intervened before that could happen. They arrested McGahan and put him in jail to await trial. But the story of the saloon murder had already spread like wildfire all across Ohio. It was a messy, dramatic case with a notorious defendant, and as a result, the trial itself became a very high-profile event. Every single day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists from all over the state, important local figures, and curious members of the public all came to sit in the gallery and listen to the testimony unfold. And right now, all of these important people were sitting there watching Clement's defense case get absolutely obliterated by this one single witness. The witness on the stand was one of the men who had been in the saloon on the night of the murder. And he was making a very, very big claim. He was telling the court that even though nobody saw McGahan fire a gun, he was certain McGahan was the shooter. The witness said that right after the gunshot went off, he looked over and he saw a little puff of smoke coming out of McGahan's jacket pocket. The implication was clear. McGahan had his gun hidden inside his jacket, and he had fired it through the fabric to conceal the weapon. As the witness explained this theory, Clement looked around the courtroom. He saw people in the jury box nodding their heads. He saw journalists in the gallery scribbling furiously in their notepads. It was clear that everyone was buying it. What the witness said seemed to make perfect sense to them. At that point, Clement could tell that basically everyone in that room thought his client was guilty. But Clement did not agree. He knew his client's case looked terrible. He knew the public opinion was stacked against him. But Clement was absolutely certain deep down in his gut that Thomas McGahan was innocent. Clement had his own theory about what had happened that night in the saloon. He believed that the victim, Tom Myers, had actually shot himself by accident. He thought that during the chaotic brawl, Myers had tried to pull out his own gun to defend himself, but in the struggle he fumbled it and the gun went off, killing him. Unfortunately for Clement, this was 1,871. There was no advanced forensic science. There were no ballistics experts or gunshot residue tests. The only piece of physical evidence in the entire case was a few scorch marks on Tom Myers' shirt where the bullet had entered. So, the whole trial was really just based on what the witnesses said, and this particular witness was being very, very convincing for the prosecution. The prosecutor finished up his questioning with a confident flourish. He walked back to his table with a little smirk on his face, like he knew he had just landed the winning blow. He had pretty much just won the entire case with that one testimony. Now it was Clement's turn to cross-examine the witness. And honestly, he had no idea how it was going to go. He felt like he was facing a brick wall. But as Clement stood up from his chair and started to walk across the courtroom floor, a strange sense of calm came over him. He was thinking to himself, I really don't have that much to lose here. Pretty much everyone in this state already thinks my client is a murderer. So if he's found guilty, nobody is going to be shocked. But maybe, just maybe, I can find a way to prove he's innocent. And that would be a huge victory. And if I don't, well, it is what it is. To understand Clement's mindset, you have to know that he was a very controversial figure in Ohio at that time, which was right after the end of the Civil War. During the war, he had been a very vocal opponent of the president, Abraham Lincoln. His political viewpoints had actually gotten him banished from Ohio and the other northern states for a time. After the war ended, he was allowed to return to his home state of Ohio, and he went back to practicing law. But he had never really been able to fix his damaged public image. Even now, 6 years later, a lot of people in Ohio still really hated him for his behavior during the war. So in his mind, Clement knew that losing this case wasn't going to change much for him personally. Nothing would really change. He'd still be the guy that a lot of people disliked, and his client would be the convicted murderer everyone already thought he was. It is what it is. But if he won, if he could somehow pull off an acquittal in this impossible case, he could completely reinvent himself. He would no longer be the disgraced politician. He would be known as the sensational criminal defense lawyer who could overturn even the most hopeless cases. And again, he genuinely believed his client was innocent. So this would be a major victory on two fronts for Clement. It would be a professional triumph and a personal vindication. So, with this renewed sense of purpose, Clement stepped up to the witness box. He began firing off one question after another at the witness. By the end of the day, Clement had managed to get that witness to admit that he hadn't actually seen a physical gun in McGeehan's hand or in his pocket. He had only seen the smoke. Then, Clement delivered his final blow to the prosecution's theory. He had the jacket that McGeehan had been wearing that night brought into the court as evidence. He showed it to the judge and the jury, and he was able to prove that there was no hole anywhere on it. Not a single tear or burn mark. The jacket shooting theory was completely destroyed. As the week went on, more and more witnesses took the stand. Clement was pleased to find that none of them had any actual proof that McGeehan had shot Tom Myers. But, on the other hand, he also couldn't find any solid evidence that proved his client was innocent either. He had poked holes in the prosecution's case, but he hadn't built a strong case of his own. So, later that week, on Friday, June 16th, as the trial was coming to a close, Clement was starting to get worried again. He knew that he had done a lot, but he also knew it probably wasn't enough to get his client acquitted. And even though he knew the odds were always stacked against him, he now felt like victory was possible. It was almost within his grasp, and now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. That afternoon, Clement sat behind the defense table, sweating under his collar as he listened to the prosecutor's team deliver their closing arguments. And they were brutal. They painted McGeehan as a cold-blooded killer and tore apart every little bit of doubt Clement had tried to create. This was giving Clement a lot of anxiety. He was just moments away from having to give his own closing arguments. This was his very last chance to convince the jury that his client was innocent. But he just did not feel like the speech he had prepared was going to be enough, especially not after the powerful and convincing speech the prosecutor was giving right now. And so, as the prosecutor eloquently wrapped up his speech, Clement was furiously crossing out lines on his own notes, trying to rewrite things, trying to make it better, stronger. But nothing was coming to him. He just sat there, racking his brain, trying to think of what to say. The prosecutor sat down, and the entire courtroom fell silent. Everybody was looking at Clement, waiting for him to stand up and deliver his closing argument. And as he sat there in that heavy silence, an idea suddenly hit him. It hit him so hard that he actually dropped his pen on the floor. He didn't know why this idea hadn't occurred to him earlier. It was so obvious. He suddenly realized there was a way he could definitively prove McGeehan was innocent. And if he was right, he would go down in history as perhaps the greatest defense attorney Ohio had ever seen. Clement lunged for his pen again. He frantically started scribbling down the details of his new idea. A minute later, he heard the judge call his name, telling him it was his turn to speak. And so he shot to his feet and he cleared his throat. But instead of launching into the speech he had prepared for this moment, he did something unexpected. He asked the judge to let him deliver his closing argument on Monday instead. The judge was a little hesitant at first, but after some consideration, he agreed. And when he did, Clement felt a huge surge of excitement rush through his body. After the court proceedings officially ended for the day, Clement could not get out of that courthouse fast enough. He had a plan, and he needed to put it into motion. Clement waited until nightfall to act. He needed to run a test to make sure his theory, the one he was going to present on Monday, was correct. But he didn't want anyone from the prosecution team to see him doing it. So, after having dinner with some friends, Clement slipped out of his hotel and into the quiet, dark streets of Lebanon. While he was at dinner, he had been pretty vague about what he actually planned to do that night. But he did tell his friends that they really needed to stay in town long enough to hear his big final argument on Monday. He was that confident in what he was about to uncover. He was sure his speech on Monday would be one of the greatest legal moments in the history of Ohio. And so now, as Clement made his way to the edge of town, he was filled with adrenaline. He kept walking faster and faster until he was basically at a full run. And then he finally arrived at a quiet, isolated part of Lebanon. As soon as he got there, he set up for the test he had planned, and then he ran through it. After he finished, a wide smile spread across Clement's face. He knew, without a single doubt, that he had just found a way to prove that his client was innocent. Just a few minutes later, around 9 o'clock that evening, Clement was back inside of his hotel room. He was so excited about the results of his test that he couldn't even sit down. He just kept pacing back and forth around and around the small room, trying to get his thoughts in order, but he was just too excited. His hotel room door was cracked open, and as he was pacing, he saw his co-counsel, another lawyer on the defense team, walking by in the hallway. This hotel was sort of the home base for everyone who was in town for the trial. So most of the lawyers from both the prosecution and the defense teams were staying there. When Clement saw his co-counsel, he immediately waved him inside. He tried to tell him what he had figured out, but the words just kind of tumbled out in a jumbled mess. All he really managed to get across was that the prosecution had it all wrong, and that he, Clement, had figured out the truth. But his co-counsel was just looking at him with a confused expression, like he really didn't understand a word he was saying. And so, at some point, Clement realized that words weren't going to be enough. He needed to do a physical demonstration. He needed to repeat the test he had just done out in the field to actually show his co-counsel exactly what he was talking about. So, without much more explanation, Clement got up. He set up the test right there in the hotel room. He then turned to his co-counsel and told him to watch carefully. And then Clement began to perform the test. But this time, something went horribly wrong. During the demonstration, there was a sudden, loud explosion, and Clement collapsed to the ground. It would turn out that Clement's test did prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that his client really was innocent. His theory was that Tom Myers had shot himself by accident, by fumbling with his own gun. But in order to make sure his theory would hold up with the jury, he wanted to show everyone that it was definitely physically possible for that to happen. So, when Clement had gone to the edge of town to do the test by himself for the first time, he had taken a gun with him. He basically experimented with ways the accident could have happened. He shot the gun through pieces of fabric from different angles, and he looked at the resulting scorch marks. And when he did this, he realized that the scorch marks that had been left on the victim's clothes, which was the only forensic evidence they had, could have only been made if the victim was shot at point-blank range. This meant that Thomas McGeehan, who was standing several feet away during the fight, was simply too far away to have been the shooter. But it was not until later, when Clement acted out the shooting again for his co-counsel in the hotel room, that his discovery went from great to perfect. Because completely by accident, he did exactly what he believed Tom Myers had done that night. He fumbled with the gun, and he shot himself. Clement died from his self-inflicted wound 12 hours later. But his death made his argument so powerful and so convincing that his client, Thomas McGahan, was eventually acquitted. So Clement had been right. This was the greatest case of his life. It was also his last. Our second and final story is about a song, but we're not going to be playing this song during the episode. And when you get to the end of this story, you'll see why. On an overcast, chilly Sunday in the fall of 1932, a 32-year-old composer named Rezo Cherish sat in his small apartment in Paris trying to write a new melody. He had been at it for hours and hours, and it was not going well at all. Each time he managed to jot down a new combination of notes, he would play it back, hate it, and then tear up the sheet of paper and toss it into his trash bin. The bin was already overflowing with a pile of other discarded drafts. Now, Rezo was used to this kind of messy, creative process. He had made a name for himself as a musician back in his home country of Hungary over the last decade. He had written more than 40 different musical compositions for various singers and artists, and a few of them had been really successful. So Rezo knew, deep down, that he had the talent to be a huge star. He believed he could change people's lives with his music. But recently, despite trying many different approaches and just letting the messy creative process happen, Rezo still could not come up with any new work that he felt was any good. A big part of the problem was that he was incredibly stressed out. At this point in 1932, Rezo and many other people were very nervous about the state of the world and what the future might hold. There were very violent and hateful political views that were spreading across Europe, especially in Germany. This was still 7 years before the official start of World War II, but Hitler and his Nazi party were already starting to gain a lot of power. And Rezo, who was Jewish, was deeply worried about all the anti-Jewish rhetoric that the Nazis were spreading. And while that was terrifying and kept him up at night, the more urgent day-to-day worry that was really blocking his creativity was a more practical one: how to literally afford to buy food. The world was also in the middle of the Great Depression, which was a period of time in the 1920s and 30s when multiple countries were dealing with terrible economies and massive unemployment. Back in Rezo's home country of Hungary, things were especially bad, and they were getting worse every day. Banks and businesses were closing down almost daily. More than a quarter of the entire population was unemployed and living in extreme poverty. Rezo had moved to Paris, hoping to find more opportunities. Paris, after all, was considered the art mecca of Europe. And even though the state of the world felt depressing and dark, Rezo thought that the creative energy in Paris would inspire him to create something beautiful in the middle of all the darkness. But now, as Rezo sighed and leaned back in his chair, he looked around his tiny, drafty Parisian apartment. He had been here for months, and his fortunes had certainly not changed. He still didn't have any work, and he still could not seem to write anything good. But Rezo, he kept trying. He would lean back over his piano and try to write, but almost immediately he would tear up the paper. He was just getting more and more frustrated with himself until finally he just gave up. He put his head in his hands and basically said out loud, "I can't do this." It seemed like the harder he worked and the harder he tried to ignore all the despair and sadness and the awful things that were going on in the world, the worse he felt. And obviously, the worse his work was. Right now, he actually almost felt physically sick from bottling up all of these terrible competing feelings and thoughts. But as he thought about the fact that he was bottling everything up, he suddenly decided he just couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't continue to keep all of that stuff locked inside. And it was at that exact moment that Rezo took a deep breath and he let in all of the anguish that he had been trying so hard to push away. Sadness and fear and a quiet sense of desperation just washed over him and into him. And this time, he didn't fight it. He just let it happen. And then suddenly, he started writing. His pen flew across the page as wave after wave of these terrible emotions hit him. When he was done, he ran over to his piano to play the notes that he had just written down. And as his fingers moved across the keys, a very slow, very sad melody began to fill the small room. It was so beautiful and so incredibly sad that he actually felt like he was going to cry just from hearing it himself. When he was done playing, he just sat back in his chair. And now, tears were filling his eyes, and his heart was pounding so fast that he knew he needed to get some fresh air, and fast, or he might actually just pass out. And so Rezo went outside to take a walk. He hoped the fresh air would help him snap out of the wild emotional fog that had just come over him. But the Paris streets were gray and cold, and this new melody just continued to ring in his ears. He was thrilled that he had actually written something real and powerful for the first time in what felt like a very long time. But it was such an intense expression of his own personal sadness that it almost hurt to have created it. Shortly into his walk, he heard somebody call his name. When he looked up, he saw it was his good friend, a poet named Yo Yavor, who was rushing right up to him. And right away, when Rezo saw his friend, he felt himself lightening up just a little bit. He liked Laszlo. They were both Hungarians living in Paris, trying to make good art and make a name for themselves, but neither of them had really succeeded yet. But as soon as Laszlo reached him, Rezo could tell that his friend seemed really upset about something too. His friend told him that his fiancée had just ended their engagement, and he was completely heartbroken. After Rezo said that he was terribly sorry to hear that, the two men just walked together in silence for a while. They were both lost in their own sad, heavy feelings, and neither of them could think of anything to say. And then, without even meaning to, Rezo just began to whistle the song that he had just written. And when he did this, it was like the tune had an immediate effect on Laszlo. His friend's eyes welled up with tears, and he sort of began to cry. And also, he began to sing along to the melody using words from a very sad poem that he himself had recently written. Rezo couldn't believe it. Without even trying, Laszlo's words were a perfect fit for his melody. And as this sort of impromptu collaboration began, the two men went from this really dark, gloomy mood to a purely excited one. They were so inspired that they rushed into a nearby restaurant to sit down and work out the rest of the song. Before they knew it, Rezo had written an entire composition with Laszlo's lyrics. The song was about someone whose lover had just died, and their deep desire to be reunited with them in the afterlife, Pakis. When the men finished, they wanted to hear their new song out loud. So they asked the restaurant's resident musicians if they would play it for them. And pretty soon, their song, something that hadn't even existed just a few hours ago, was being played throughout the crowded restaurant. And as far as Rezo and Laszlo could tell, everybody inside was loving this song. Some of the restaurant patrons actually started to cry. Others closed their eyes and just kind of swayed to the sad sound. It was exactly what Rezo had always hoped his music would do, which was to truly and deeply affect those who heard it. Rezo and Laszlo looked at each other, and for the first time in days, they both smiled. Rezo and Laszlo decided to call their song Gloomy Sunday since it had been created on that hazy fall Sunday. They both had a feeling that this particular tune was very special, and that it would finally be the thing that changed both of their lives for the better. So, over the next few months, they took the song around to different music producers and tried to get somebody to buy it. And finally, someone did. A company agreed to publish the sheet music and to record the song. After that, Rezo went back to his shabby Parisian apartment, and he waited. He waited for the song to take hold, for it to become a hit, and for the money to start pouring in. But that is not what happened. As the months passed by, Rezo didn't hear Gloomy Sunday on the radio. He didn't see it on any music charts. He didn't hear it in other restaurants or being performed in theaters. It was like the song had never even existed at all. And this completely crushed Rezo. He was even more upset and defeated than he had been before he had written it, because now he had gotten a taste of hope. And it felt so much worse to fail after that. The rest of Rezo's life, and the state of the world, got worse too. The Great Depression was still going strong. And as Hitler got more and more popular, people started to wonder if there was going to be a major war. So Rezo and pretty much everyone else around him just sank further and further into their fears and worries and kept praying for something, anything, to change. 3 years later, on a spring evening in 1935, Rezo was back in Hungary. He was walking down a street in the country's capital city, Budapest. He was on his way to a friend's house. But as he strolled down the sidewalk, he heard a song coming from an open window of a nearby apartment. He stopped cold in his tracks, and his heart began to pound in his chest, because he knew that song. It was his. It was Gloomy Sunday. Rezo had no idea how or why he was hearing his song. As far as he knew, no one had really been that interested in it. But it was completely shocking. Someone he didn't know was listening to his song on the radio. That meant it was being put out on the airwaves, that it was being consumed by the public. This was incredible. And so Rezo just stood there on the sidewalk, letting his own notes wash over him, hearing it out in public for the very first time. And when the song was done, he just stood there for another moment and just absolutely beamed with joy. After that day, for months, Gloomy Sunday was everywhere. Rezo heard it being played at social gatherings. He heard it streaming from people's windows. Street performers sang it to people passing by, and it was even performed at big concert venues all over the city. And so by the end of that year, it seemed like there was hardly anyone in all of Hungary who hadn't heard and loved his song. Rezo even read in the newspapers that his song was being played in England, in France, and as far away as the United States. So Rezo knew that he had actually done it. He had finally realized his dream of being a successful, internationally recognized composer with a hit song that truly resonated with the public. A few months later, on a morning in late February of 1936, Rezo left his apartment and was heading out for the day. And on his way down the street, he passed by a newsstand. He happened to notice that one of the headlines mentioned his song Gloomy Sunday. Initially, he was really excited to see that he was getting some press coverage. So, he immediately grabbed a copy of the newspaper and opened it up to read the article. But as his eyes scanned the page, his stomach completely flipped. Because this was not good press. In fact, what this article had to say was so terrible that Rezo's first reaction was that he must have read it wrong. And so, he read it again, and then a third time, and then a fourth time. But each time he read it, it just said the same horrible thing. And so Rezo found himself starting to panic. He quickly shut the paper and just began looking around him. He saw there were a few other people who were also standing by the newsstand, and they were reading the same paper. And they were all talking to one another in hushed, worried voices and pointing at that same headline about his song. And Rezo just stood there, listening to this unsettling murmur and feeling a wave of absolute horror wash over him. Over the next month, more and more headlines about Rezo's song continued to appear in the papers. And it was like each day, they only got worse. And then the story went international. The Catholic Church weighed in on it. And then the police got involved. Finally, one afternoon at the end of March in 1936, Rezo was sitting at his piano, just staring down at the keys. He knew he should be writing music, but instead he was just filled with a sense of dread, just like he had been every single day since he first read that dreadful headline. And then suddenly, there was a sharp knock at his door. And when Rezo got up and answered it, a cold sweat broke out all over his body because it was the Budapest police. And they wanted him to come down to the station with them. Rezo's pulse raced with nerves. But at this point, he wasn't really surprised. Because by now, he knew that writing Gloomy Sunday had been a horrific, terrible mistake. Because it would turn out, Gloomy Sunday had been a very shockingly impactful song, just as Rezo had thought he wanted it to be. But over the course of the last year, the police had begun finding its sheet music, or its written lyrics, or the actual song playing on record players at the scenes of suicides. Dozens and dozens of people across Hungary, across Europe, and in the United States from police officers to teenagers to waitstaff to students, had taken their own lives, basically while listening to Gloomy Sunday. These deaths became so widespread that a Hungarian archbishop actually wrote a public letter to the people begging them to stop hurting themselves. And multiple official bans of the song itself were enacted across Europe and England and the United States. On the day that the Budapest police knocked on Rezo's door, they demanded that he stop all sales of the song. And Rezo immediately agreed. And eventually, so did the song's publisher and his musical partner, Laszlo. And Rezo's partner, Laszlo, was especially grief-stricken by this whole thing. Because his fiancée, the one who had broken his heart on the very day he had written the song with Rezo, she ended up being one of the many suicide victims. Before she took her own life, she sent Laszlo a telegram which simply said, "Gloomy Sunday." No one knows for sure why Gloomy Sunday potentially caused this sudden wave of death. One theory is that people were already really suffering from depression and feeling hopeless because of the Great Depression and the worsening political climate. And the song's popularity was either a terrible coincidence or it served as a sort of unfortunate trigger for those who were already on the edge. As for Rezo, he was devastated by the dark legacy of his song. Even though it did technically live up to his original vision, it did deeply resonate with people and was unquestionably a hit. It was a nightmare. Over the years, despite all the negative associations with the song, it's been translated into 28 different languages and was even performed by legendary singers like Frank Sinatra and Billie Holiday. Initially, there was an estimated 20 suicides attributed to Gloomy Sunday across Europe and the United States. In the years that have followed, however, the lore around the song has only grown, and some estimates now put the death toll in the hundreds. Although these numbers are very difficult to verify, Rezo never wrote another hit song. And in fact, ultimately, he followed in the footsteps of some of his listeners. He jumped out of the window of his 8th-floor apartment on another overcast, gloomy Sunday, and he died 2 days later. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the evening of Friday, the 12th of January, 2007, a college freshman by the name of Wade Steffi, who was 19 years old at the time, ventured inside the Ford Dining Hall, which is located on the campus of Purdue University. Not only is Purdue University in Indiana a respected and well-known institution of higher learning, but it is also well known for the exceptional academic programs that it offers, in addition to the substantial athletic opportunities that it provides. When it came to a situation like that, Wade was the perfect option to meet the requirements. A full academic scholarship to attend Purdue University was awarded to him because he was such a clever young man. He was so brilliant that he was able to attend Purdue University. At the time, he was working toward earning a degree in aviation technology, a field that held the potential to provide him with a future that was not only fascinating but also dense with prospects. He had his entire life ahead of him, a life that he had worked incredibly hard to get up to this point. He had a lot of work to do. Approximately 7:20 minutes before 7 o'clock in the evening, he entered the dining hall. In the spring semester, which had only begun a few days earlier, this was the very first Friday night of the semester. Put yourself in that space and try to imagine the buzzing energy that was there. The sound of buzzing could be heard. Students were distributed around the tables, and they were all engaged in conversation, laughter, and the process of making plans for the forthcoming weekend. There were a huge number of students. There was a distinct sense of excitement in the air, the kind of energy that can only be found at the beginning of something new for the first time. After Wade had finished acquiring a tray of food, he went to find a table where he could eat with a couple of his closest friends. He took a seat and immediately began participating in the discourse that was taking place. They talked about the new classes that they were going to be attending, the parties that were going to take place that evening, and the activities that they were going to take part in now that they were going to be coming back to school. There was nothing out of the usual about it, and that was the typical way of life in college. Over the course of nearly 1 hour, Wade sat there, exhibiting all of the qualities that are typical of a college student. He had a sense of freedom and possibilities throughout the time that he was surrounded by his friends. It was almost 8:20 o'clock in the evening when Wade looked at the time and realized that he needed to get going in order to meet his obligations. He stood up, said his goodbyes to the group, and then started to clear his tray in the same way that he had done 100 times before. He had done this 100 times before. After entering the chamber through the same doors that he had used to enter, he exited the room and stepped out into the brisk air of January. As soon as he was outside, he made a sharp right-left and continued to walk the very short distance to the building that was located just next to the dining hall. Owen Hall was the name of the structure that housed the dormitory that was located here. Nevertheless, Wade did not live at Owen Hall as his residence hall. It turned out to be a separate building, which was known as Carey Quad West, and it was situated on the opposite side of the dining hall from the place where he resided. In spite of this, Wade was heading to Owen since he had some additional friends who lived there, and he was going there. First, he went into Owen Hall, then he went to the room where his companions were staying, and last he went into the room. Already present at the beginning of the weekend were a few people who were simply lounging around, engaged in discussion, and drinking a few alcoholic beverages. This was the beginning of the weekend. Wade sat down and had a few of drinks for himself in addition to joining them in their activity. It took him about an hour to simply hang out and catch up with everyone. He did this without doing anything else. The gathering that took place before the party was relaxed and unstructured in its mood. At that point, which was somewhere about 9:30 o'clock in the evening, the entire party arrived at the consensus that it was time to leave and head to the main event. In the direction of a major party that was being held at one of the organizations on campus, they left Owen Hall together and started walking approximately half a mile to the west, away from the core section of the school. They were heading in the direction of the party. For a considerable amount of time, Wade remained present at the fraternity celebration. During the time that he was simply having a wonderful time with his friends, the music was playing at a very loud volume, and the facility was entirely full. An idea, on the other hand, came to him at around midnight. He was immediately impressed by it. He went to one of his friends and told him that he had just recalled something that he had been thinking about. He then thanked him for his attention. It was discovered that he had left his jacket at the room of his friend in Owen Hall, which he had forgotten earlier. Despite the fact that it was a chilly evening, he had the want to go back to the spot and collect it. This was a clear and commonplace justification for leaving a party. It was the kind of thing that happens on a regular basis when people leave parties. However, this seemingly little action would set in motion a chain of bad and odd circumstances that would inevitably follow. The fact that all of the dormitories on the Purdue campus lock up at night for reasons of safety was one of the obstacles that needed to be overcome. The only way to access the building after a given hour is if you are a resident of that particular building and hold a key card, or if you know someone who lives within the building and can physically unlock the door for you. If you do not meet either of these requirements, you will not be able to enter the facility. Wade could not simply swipe his way inside the building because he did not live in Owen Hall. This prevented him from entering the building. It was necessary for him to rely on one of his friends who lived there in order to acquire entry to the location. Therefore, as soon as he started walking back towards Owen Hall, he pulled out his mobile phone and began conversing on it till he reached his destination. Wade would make a total of 6 phone calls over the course of his journey, urgently trying to locate someone, anybody, in Owen Hall who would answer the door and open it for him. He would do this in an effort to find someone who would help him. However, despite his best efforts, he was not successful in accomplishing what he set out to do. It was a total of 4 calls that he made, 4 of which were to fictitious phone numbers. You are able to anticipate the confusion that he will feel. A person would answer the phone when he dialed the number, and he would ask them to let him into Owen Hall. He would do this again and again. On the other hand, the individual who answered the phone would not have any previous knowledge of the subject matter that he was discussing. They would hang up the phone after stating, "I'm sorry, you've got the wrong number," before saying the phrase. Additionally, he called 2 people who he was positive truly lived within Owen Hall. He was certain that they were resident there. Nevertheless, they did not answer their phones when they were phoned, and it is unclear what would have caused this. Maybe they had already gone to sleep, maybe they had their phones muted, or maybe they were still present at the party or other event. All of these possibilities are possible. Their phones continued to ring and ring until they reached the voicemail system, regardless of the circumstances that they were in. As a result of this, Wade went back to Owen Hall at about 12:30 inches the morning, having exhausted all of the options that were accessible to him. Then he approached the primary glass doors, which were now securely shut, and started hammering on them. However, they were still open. He took his phone out of his pocket and then reinserted it into his pocket a moment later. He was expecting that a local resident who was already inside would notice him and let him in. He had high hopes that this would happen. Additionally, in the end, it was finished by somebody. After hearing the banging, a student who lived in Owen Hall went to the door to see what was going on. They were curious about what was going on. This student was not someone Wade had ever encountered before, and Wade himself was not familiar with them. When the student peered through the glass, they saw Wade standing there. Wade was there. To phrase it another way, the student made a choice at that very instant in time. They were of the opinion that Wade was incapable of entering the building since he appeared to be under the influence of alcohol. It's possible that they were trying to follow the guidelines, but it's also possible that they simply did not want to be responsible for him. Both of these possibilities are possible. The decision that they made was to not allow him to enter. A tiny shake of the head was given by each of them as they stepped away from the entrance. Even though Wade remained to stand there for a short while longer, likely knocking a few more times in astonishment, he eventually just gave up and walked away. He had no chance of convincing himself otherwise. He then proceeded away from the doors and disappeared into the darkness after he had turned around and turned around again. Following the passage of a few days, we are now on the 16th of January, which is a Tuesday. After spending the lengthy weekend away from campus, Wade's roommate has finally made their way back to their dorm room in Cary Quad West. This comes after they had been absent for a considerable amount of time. His first observation was that there was no one else there in the room. He was the only person there. The absence of Wade was unmistakable. If he had not slept in his bed for at least a few days, it seemed as though he had not been there for quite some time. The roommate did not give it any attention when it first occurred to her that she might be committing the act. There is a possibility that Wade was either at the library or in class at the time. Nevertheless, as the hours passed and there was still no trace of him, a microscopic seed of anxiety began to become more and more obvious. This concern was growing in intensity. He attempted to contact Wade by calling him and sending him texts, but he did not encounter any reaction from him. There was no response to any of the texts that were sent, and all of the calls were forwarded to the voicemail system. The roommate's level of concern escalated, and she started asking other people on their floor whether or not they had seen Wade. She was concerned that Wade might have been hiding elsewhere. The reaction was consistent throughout the entire process. He had not been seen by anyone since Friday night, when he was last spotted. At this time, the anxiety had evolved into a legitimate alarm that needed to be addressed. After much deliberation, the roommate took the decision to communicate with Wade's family in the expectation that they would be aware of his whereabouts. There was a possibility that he had made the choice to spend the weekend at home without alerting anyone before making the decision. The moment he did eventually get the chance to talk to them, however, his heart sank. There was not a single member of Wade's family who was aware of his whereabouts. They were looking forward to hearing from him rather than hearing about him from other people. At the end of the day, the issue was glaringly obvious to everyone who was paying attention. After investigation, it was found that Wade's Steffi had disappeared. This information was communicated to the authorities, and they immediately began working to address the matter. One of the first things that they did was contact Wade's mobile phone operator to inquire about the possibilities of tracking his phone. This was one of the first things that they began doing. It was possible for the provider to receive a signal from it while it was in operation. The fact that the phone was being utilized was a development that held a favorable significance, Unfortunately, the location was extremely vague, which was a turn of events that was not to be expected. But the one thing that they were able to prove was that Wade's mobile phone continued to be located somewhere on the enormous Purdue campus. This was the only thing that they were able to verify. Any place could have been the venue of the event. The evening of that day, a comprehensive search that included the entire campus was undertaken. I applaud the effort that you put forth in this matter. A significant number of law enforcement officials and volunteers carried out a comprehensive search that covered the entirety of the grounds of the university. The school's equestrian club, which consisted of pupils exploring the nearby fields and woodlands while mounted on horses, was also responsible for giving their involvement. They looked in every potential site where a person could be, they searched inside buildings, they searched in green locations, and they looked in every imaginable position. To the contrary, despite the enormous search effort that would continue for a number of weeks, very little was found. This was the case despite the fact that the search would continue. In order to establish Wade's existence, they would only find a single pair of his shoes when they searched for him. After only a little over 4 days after the beginning of the search, the shoe is found once more on the 20th of January. It was built in a location that was right outside of an exterior entry that went into a maintenance room for Owen Hall, which was situated inside the structure. This was a vital opportunity for the case to be broken, and it was taken advantage of. Owen Hall was the very last location that Wade attempted to access, and it was the site that he was unsuccessful. It appeared as though the discovery of his shoe just there was evidence that he had been in that particular location. Once they arrived, the detectives immediately concentrated their attention on the maintenance room as the first area they found themselves. Once they had opened the door, they began to conduct a thorough check of the area immediately surrounding it. Wade, on the other hand, was not even present. In spite of the fact that the area was nothing more than a utility compartment, there was no evidence to suggest that he had ever been inside. Despite the fact that the shoe was a clue, an impasse was reached as a result of the hint that led to the shoe. There seems to be no end to the weeks. Although the investigation continued, there was a growing sense of pessimism about the outcome. Following over a month of searching, the official search was finally called off. During that period, there were no fresh leads discovered, and Wade was nowhere to be seen. Finally, the search was called off. The fact that Wade's family and friends were in the dark about his death caused them to suffer in great sorrow. Recently, his disappearance had taken place on a college campus that was teeming with activity. After Wade had been reported missing for nearly 2 months, the inquiry took an unusual and unexpected turn on March 19, which was approximately 2 months later. The event took place on the 19th of March. One of the employees working in the maintenance department was carrying out his daily duties in the laundry room that was situated in the basement of Owen Hall. While he was working, he became aware of an odd sound that was coming over. An unmistakable popping sound could be heard. Initially, the worker did not have a great deal of anxiety regarding the matter. Through his deductions, he came to the conclusion that the source of the noise was most likely one of the dryers or the washing machines. Inside of a machine, there was a coin that was scattered around or a button made of metal that was being mixed up. Both of these things were loose. Within the confines of a laundry room, it was a disturbance that was heard rather frequently. He continued with his task, but 1 moment later, he was confronted with yet another hearing of it. What a pop! The following time, he made the choice to investigate the matter further. He started moving around the laundry room, pausing at regular intervals to pay close attention to each of the machines that were functioning in an effort to locate the source of the noise. He was trying to determine where the noise was coming from. During this time, he once again heard the popping sound. However, this time it was abundantly clear that the sound was not coming from any of the washers or dryers or any other device. He was able to positively identify the source of the sound. The fact of the situation is that it was not actually coming from within the laundry room at all. This is the genuine reality. It originated from a point that was not in close proximity to the entrance of the hall. The worker entered the corridor after developing a sense of curiosity, which led him to leave the washing room and proceed to enter the corridor. When he had finished standing there in the tranquil ambiance of the corridor that led down to the basement, he heard the pop once more. At this point, it was much simpler to comprehend. This time, the sound was coming from behind the locked door that was located directly across from the laundry room, and it was clear that it was coming from that particular location. After taking out his enormous ring of keys, the worker found the key that was suitable with the lock, and then he released it. This allowed him to unlock the door that was directly in front of him. He went inside in order to gain access. After a few moments had passed, he would have a realization that would be quite upsetting. We are now in a position to reconstruct the specific events that took place with Wade Steffi during the early morning hours of January 13th. This is made possible by the fact that this discovery was made, as well as the subsequent study that was carried out. Wade did not simply leave the building after being denied entrance into Owen Hall, nor did he simply walk away from the building after the student refused to unlock the door because they believed he was too intoxicated. Both of these events occurred after Wade was denied access into Owen Hall. In his determination to collect his jacket, he had not wavered in the least. As a consequence of this, he left the building by the front doors and then found his way to the left side of the structure where he looked for an alternative access point. During the course of his exploration of the building, he came across an additional entrance. It should come as no surprise that the pupils were not supposed to get access through this particular entryway. Although there was no sign on it that proclaimed "Keep Out," it was extremely obvious when it was present. This was the case even though there was no official notice. There was no question in anyone's mind that the metal railing that was installed along the exterior of this door was there for the sole purpose of preventing people from even coming close to making contact with it. By itself, the door was not built at ground level. It was erected by someone else. Construction was carried out in the basement, where it was positioned into a concrete pit for the purpose of construction. In order for you to go up to it, you would have to first jump down into this pit and then climb over the safety barrier. This would be essential. Because this door was constantly locked, it was essential to acquire a key in order to get entry to it by any means required. This door could only be accessed by going through the building, which was the correct way there. In contrast, it was predetermined that this would be the outcome. Despite the fact that Wade was under the influence of alcohol at the time, he did not perceive any danger when he came upon this entrance on the side of Owen Hall that was definitely off limits. He was aware of a problem that could arise. In light of the fact that he believed it would be an excellent notion, he made the decision to attempt to get in this method. As far as he was concerned, the events that were taking place behind the door were of no consequence to him. If he were to get inside a piece of Owen Hall, he reasoned, he would be able to find his way up to his friend's room and reclaim his jacket. He would be able to do this if he could just sneak inside. As a consequence of this, he raced straight toward the railing. Following his ascent over it, he made a hasty descent into the small concrete hole that was situated below. As soon as he landed in front of the door, he stretched out and grabbed the doorknob, and then he began working on it. His surprise was compounded by the fact that it was fully open. There was no lock located on it. Upon entering the room, he was the one who opened the door and entered. Immediately after that, he was completely and utterly enveloped in darkness, beginning at that very moment. The buzzing and churning of machines all around him was the only sound he could hear in the darkness. That was the only sound he could hear. The rest of the world was also silent. Even though he was under the influence of alcohol, he was able to return to the realization that this was still a good strategy. The fact that he was unable to find a light switch was the only reason why he was actually concerned about the situation. It was so dark inside that he was worried that if the door closed behind him, not only would his one and only source of light be cut off, but the door would actually lock, so confining him inside this peculiar space that was gloomy. He was anxious about this because the temperature inside was so low. With that in mind, he came up with an easy solution to the issue. Kneeling down, removing one of his shoes, and tucking it into the door jamb were the steps he took in order to successfully prop the door open. A sliver of light from the outside was able to penetrate the chamber as a result of the door being propped open behind him. He then began to advance further into the area as a result of this. After that, he was involved in a collision with a massive metal structure. This took place almost quickly after that. Due to the fact that it was still too dark, he was unable to see what it was, yet he was strongly aware of its presence. It was a metal structure that was flat and appeared to be a massive cabinet or a machine of some kind. The object was something that was flat. Upon hearing the buzzing and whirring sound, he was able to discover that it was one of the machines that was responsible for making the sound. Recently, he came to the conclusion that he would make an effort to walk around everything. His objective was straightforward. He needed to go through this room, find another door on the opposite side, and then continue his journey up into the dormitory. He intended to do all of these things. Wade moved his hand all the way along the edge of the machine as he began to go toward the left side of the machine. He was under the assumption that the machine had to stop working at some point in order for him to be able to go around it. This machine, on the other hand, turned out to be exceedingly enormous and incredibly wide from the beginning. When he eventually reached the left edge of it, he was so close to the wall of the room that he was almost touching it. He was in such close proximity to the wall. Upon his arrival, he became aware of the fact that the space that existed between the side of the machine and the wall of the chamber was only slightly larger than what would allow a human to pass through. This realization came to him almost immediately. If he turned his body to the side, there is a chance that he possesses the ability to make it. Despite the fact that he was not sure of the precise distance that this odd gadget traveled back into the room, he was of the opinion that it was a good idea. In order to accomplish this, he arranged himself in such a way that his chest was facing the machine and his back was against the wall of the room. The next thing he did was begin the process of forcing himself into the limited space within the room. He was holding his hands up in a manner that was comparable to protecting his face and neck from whatever was in front of him while he was slowly making his way through. He was doing this while he was slowly making his way through. A further point to consider is that at some point in time, while he was strolling by himself, he began to trip. This tight space between the machine and the wall saved him from actually falling. Yet, for a split second, he reflexively stretched out with his hands to support himself on the machine that was directly in front of him. He was essentially trapped into this narrow area between the machine and the wall. Moreover, his left ring finger was able to fit into a very small hole on the face of the machine, which was around 2 inches deep. This was a very fortunate occurrence. This terrible accident was brought about by nothing more than random occurrence. In the room that Wade was presently using for himself, the name of the room was an electrical vault. Additionally, it was outfitted with 6 large transformers that were of a high power. The machine that his finger had just become stuck inside of was one of the machines that he pointed to. What you saw was the machine. These 6 transformers were tasked with the obligation of transforming the extremely high voltage that they acquired from the major power grid into a lesser voltage that could be employed. This was the responsibility that they were tasked with. After that, this voltage was dispersed throughout Owen Hall in order to supply electricity to the lights, outlets, and everything else that was located throughout the building. Even though the majority of the exterior of these transformers had been covered with protective materials in order to lessen the likelihood of electrocution, there were still a few locations of these devices in which there was just nothing that could be done to prevent electrocution from occurring. It was quite likely that they would get electrocuted, which was a possible risk that they posed. When working with it, you needed to exercise extra caution since the hole that Wade's finger had just fallen into was 2 inches deep. This was one of those parts that required you to be extra careful. At the back of that particular hole, there was an exposed electrical conductor that was located. As soon as the tip of his finger made contact with that conductor, a rush of electricity ranging from 2,000 to 4,000 volts was shot into his body. For the purpose of providing a point of comparison, the electric chair is frequently utilized for the purpose of executing individuals, and the voltage that is typically utilized to electrocute them is 2,000 volts. It is widely believed that Wade passed away instantly. However, his body did not just fall to the ground as he died away because he was crushed up against the wall and the transformer in such a way that it was so closely packed together. This caused his body to be pressed up against both of these objects. But he proceeded to keep himself in a position that was just partially upright, with his finger still stuck inside that hole. He did this for a considerable amount of time. From that moment forward, his body continued to be electrocuted at every single second of every single day for the coming 2 months. This occurred until the month of February. At some point during the month of March, Wade's body fluids started to drain out of him, which caused the electrical current that was being pumped into him to shift its path despite the fact that it had been flowing in the other direction since the beginning of the month. A sound that sounded like it was cracking or arcing could be heard emanating from beyond his body and into the base of the earth. When the maintenance worker heard the popping sound coming from the laundry room, he knew it was originating from there. Specifically, it was the sound of the electrical current making contact with the ground. One of the only other entrances that led into the electrical vault was the door that the maintenance guy opened in order to investigate the sound. This was the only other entry that led into the vault. Nevertheless, the door that Wade had used to enter the facility was the door that led to the exterior of the structure. Upon opening the door to the interior and taking a quick look inside, the worker did not first observe Wade. He did not even notice him at first. On the other side, he had the unpleasant experience of smelling something that was rather strange. Because of this, he proceeded to advance further into the area and navigate his way around the various pieces of equipment that were there. It was at that very moment when he became aware of Wade's lifeless carcass. The shoe that Wade was wearing had at some point in time escaped from the door jamb when it was discovered by the police earlier on January 26. Wade was wearing the shoe at the time. At the time that it was found, it was no longer doing its job of keeping the door to the outside open. Within that pit area, it was just sitting there, and the door that led to the outside compartment was shut and secured. When the shoe was found, the law enforcement officers did in fact go into the electrical vault to retrieve the shoe. They did not, on the other hand, enter through the entrance that was located off the street. They navigated their way around and approached the internal entry that was identical to the one that the maintenance worker will use in the future. The laundry house was located just across the hall from this door, which was the one that was in question. And when they opened it, all they did was look into the room from the entrance, but they did not actually go inside. They did not walk all the way into the room when they entered it with their feet. During the process of shining their flashlights around the area, they became aware of the transformers and identified them. Wade's name was called out during this time. This was due to the fact that they were standing in the doorway, which prevented them from seeing him from their vantage point. It was impossible to see his body because of the large transformer that he was packed behind. This made it tough to recognize him. Consequently, this was the reason why they had previously indicated that Wade had not been present in that room throughout the entire time. The error was a bad one that was brought about by an angle that was just impossible to achieve. In the end, the investigation came to the realization that the door that connects to the exterior of the electrical vault was intended to be entirely secured at all times. This was the overall conclusion that was reached. It is quite clear that this was not the situation as a result of Wade's participation in the discussion. As a consequence of this, it was finally determined that Purdue University had engaged in negligent behavior. The parties came to an agreement that they would pay Wade's family a total of $500,000. This was the settlement that was reached. They also established a scholarship in Wade's name, which assured that his memory would be carried on by aiding other outstanding students in following their dreams at the university where Wade's life was cut so tragically short for no apparent reason. The story was one of a string of catastrophes that got progressively worse. There was a series of seemingly insignificant choices that were made on a typical Friday night, such as forgetting the jacket, not answering the phone calls, and deciding to find another way to enter, but finally led to a tragic and avoidable end. These choices included everything from forgetting the jacket to not answering the phone calls. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting till the next time we meet again. What's going on? Two classmates called Carol and Reggie discovered what seemed to be the ideal love for each other in the early 1960s while they were walking through the hallways of a high school in South Carolina. During the breaks between courses, they were the kind of pair that you would find in old yearbooks. They were always smiling, holding hands, and whispering secrets to each other. They were practically inseparable while they were not schooling together. But despite the fact that their young love appeared to be flawless, it was a chapter that came to a conclusion. The dreams that they had and the expectations that they had about what their future should be like were different. So, upon the completion of their education, they went their separate ways. He moved to the United States Navy, and then spent the subsequent years serving in various locations throughout the world. At some point during that period of time, he entered into a marriage, but it was a marriage that ended almost as fast as it had begun. Following his discharge from the military, he went back to his birthplace in South Carolina and found a position with a railroad firm that he knew he could rely on. His existence was calm and unchanging. In contrast, Carol's life went through a significantly more turbulent course. She too got married after she graduated, and then she divorced her husband. Subsequently, she went through a second marriage and another divorce. This second marriage that ended in failure would eventually lead to a situation that came dangerously close to taking her life. Carol and her daughter Rhonda, who was 10 years old at the time, were spending the 18th of February in the year 1987 inches, South Carolina. There was a knock at the door on that particular day. It was her second husband, with whom she had a strained relationship. She did not utter a single word as Carol opened the door for him. Right there in front of her young daughter, he pulled out a revolver and shot her 6 times for no apparent reason. Following the assault, he turned around and fled the scene. He was subsequently discovered by the police inside his vehicle, which was parked on the side of the road. The individual had committed suicide. By some miracle, Carol was able to be saved by the medical staff. However, the harm had already been done. She sustained injuries that would remain with her for the rest of her life. As a result, she was blind in one eye and endured persistent, ongoing discomfort throughout her life. It was necessary for her little daughter, Rhonda, to mature quickly because she was expected to take on the duty of a full-time caregiver for her mother. Carol displayed an extraordinary amount of resilience during the subsequent 8 years. Her condition gradually improved, and she was able to restore some of her independence as a result. However, just as she was beginning to feel that things were beginning to return to a more normal state, life struck her yet another heartbreaking blow. The year 1995 marked the beginning of her dreadful illness. A number of blood tests were performed on her after she went to visit a physician. It is impossible to fathom the outcomes. Carol was diagnosed with liver cancer. It was discovered that she had received a blood transfusion within the context of the life-saving operation that was performed after she had been shot. Her blood, which had been the same thing that had saved her life, had been contaminated with hepatitis C. She had contracted the virus without anybody knowing about it, and because it had been left untreated for 8 years, it had subtly ravaged her liver and led to cancer. The day that Rhonda's mother came home with the news is one that she remembers very clearly. She simply sat down in a chair and was quite silent for a considerable amount of time. Then, in a voice that was scarcely audible above a whisper, she mumbled to herself, "I just can't get away from this man. He's killing me all over again." This was a terrible and unfair turn of events. Nevertheless, Carol was a warrior in spite of everything that had happened. She made up her mind that she would not allow her injuries or her condition to define who she was. She started seeking for a job, namely one that would allow her to work inside the confines of her physical restrictions. Also, she discovered one. A local television cable business offered her a position as a customer care representative while she worked part-time for the company. It was a job that she took great pride in. For the first time in a very long time, she felt as like her life was finally, truly going back on track. It was the first time she had worked since the attack, and it was the first time she had worked since the attack. A number of years went by. After that, in the year 2000, Carol was working at her desk at the cable business when she received a call on her phone. In the same manner that she answered every other call that came in, she responded to this one with the same kind of professional greeting that she always used. On the other hand, the voice that she heard on the other end was one that she immediately recognized, a voice that she hadn't heard in an entire decade. In a formal introduction, he presented himself as Reggie Sumner. Carol took a momentary pause, her heart most likely jumping a beat. Carol's voice was full of amazement and excitement as she responded, "I'm your ex-girlfriend." "We dated in high school." She asked him, "Are you the Reggie Sumner from 1962 at Garrett High School in South Carolina?" And he stated, "Yeah, that's me." Carol's voice was full of both of these emotions. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that could not have been missed. This phone call, which began as a straightforward inquiry to the customer support department, transpired into a conversation that lasted for an hour. The topics that they discussed were broad, their children, the relationships they had been in the past, and the activities they were currently engaged in. There were almost 40 years of existence that they needed to make up for. Just as they hung up, they learned that they were still in close proximity to one another. They had been separated for such a long time that it was only natural for them to make preparations to get together and finally meet each other in person. Afterwards, Rhonda would explain that when her mother returned home that evening, she felt as though she had been a 16-year-old girl all over again. She couldn't stop gushing about how wonderful Reggie sounded, how handsome he still was, and how extremely pleased she was for their forthcoming date. She was giddy with excitement. It was a couple of days later when the date finally arrived. Rhonda was aware of the situation the moment Carol arrived at her house. She had fallen head over herself in love with Reggie once more. Her mother had fallen in love with him. The feeling was shared by both parties. More than half a year after that fortuitous phone contact, Carol and Reggie tied the knot and became husband and wife. After a long separation, they started a new life together as Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. They made a significant choice no more than a year after they had tied the knot. In order to officially retire and enjoy their golden years together, they made the decision to sell their property in South Carolina and relocate to Jacksonville, Florida. The fact that Rhonda's mother relocated was a challenging experience for her. The link between her and her mother was extremely deep because she had been her mother's caregiver for such a long period of time. While all was going on, she couldn't contain her happiness for her. Despite everything that Carol had been through, it appeared as though she had at long last discovered the source of her true happiness, the one true love of her life. Over the course of the subsequent few years, Rhonda and her mother maintained a steady presence in their relationship by talking on the phone nearly every single day. Despite the distance between them, their connection remained as strong as it had always been. When July of 2005 rolled around, however, the daily calls came to an end. After a while, Rhonda's mother stopped picking up her phone. At first, Rhonda made an effort to not be concerned. Perhaps they were absent, or perhaps they were preoccupied with something else. Following the passage of a complete 24 hours, during which neither her mother nor Reggie had communicated with her, she began to feel a growing sense of unease in her stomach. Despite the fact that Reggie was able to provide care for Carol, she was aware that he was not in the finest physical condition himself. In addition to having diabetes that was incapacitating, he had recently fractured his leg, which meant that he was confined to a wheelchair for the most part. Theirs was not the kind of couple that could just up and go on a trip without any prior planning required. In the event that they were going to be absent from the house for a considerable amount of time, they would have recognized the need for assistance and would have contacted Rhonda. Consequently, throughout the course of the subsequent couple of days, Rhonda didn't stop calling their residence. Reggie, she called him. She decided to call her mother. None of the calls were answered, however. At last, after about 72 hours of total silence, she reached a point where she could no longer stand it. After making the decision, she got into her car and drove to Jacksonville, which was a 4-hour drive, in order to personally check on them. The first thing that grabbed her attention when she arrived at their residence was the fact that the automobile that belonged to her mother and Reggie was not parked in the driveway where it was meant to be. That seemed strange to me. As she approached the front door, she noticed that the lights were on inside the house from the outside. She began by knocking, and then she knocked even louder, yelling out for her mother. There was no response to this. The feeling of fear started to take hold of me. As Rhonda turned the doorknob, she was taken aback to see that it was already unlocked. She opened the door by pushing it open and then stepped inside, raising her voice once more to summon her mother and Reggie. The home was devoid of sound. After that, she witnessed him. While they were still inside the house, their cherished puppy, Mikey, a small dog that they took with them everywhere they went, was still there. Her mind was racing. Without Mikey, if they had gone anywhere, where would they have gone? She proceeded to make her way towards the kitchen as she continued to stroll through the peaceful house. The sight of the scene caused the hairs on her arms to rise up as she arrived there. 2 dishes of food were placed on the table in the kitchen. When the food was just sitting there, it appeared as though it had been sitting there for a couple of days, as if they had been in the middle of a dinner only to have it suddenly disappear. There was a heap of filthy dishes left in the sink, and there were pans on the stove that still contained meals that had only been partially cooked. Rhonda was familiar with her mother. The person Carol was really neat and organized. When it came to her house, she was very careful. That she would have left the house in such a mess, with filthy dishes out and food left to decay on the table, is something that she would never, ever have done. Rhonda's head was suddenly riddled with warning signs that were feverishly waving. On one of the kitchen counters, however, she discovered the factor that firmly established her apprehension, the one that informed her that something was dreadfully wrong. Her eyes fell onto the only mobile phone that Reggie and Carol had shared, which was simply sitting there. There was Carol's purse right next to it. In addition to that, there was a collection of pill bottles close by. It turned out to be both of their supplements. Carol's medicine for liver cancer and Reggie's insulin are both included. These were not vitamins that could be skipped. These were medications that could save their lives, and they had to take them each and every day. Without these things, there was no way that they would have left the house or fled the community. There was no way. Rhonda realized at that same instant that this was not a vacation. This was a critical situation. The Jacksonville Police Department received an immediate contact from her, and she quickly filed a report of a missing individual. The incident of the elderly couple who had gone missing quickly became a topic of discussion in the media. There were photographs of Carol and Reggie being shown on local and national networks, and they were begging the public for any information they could provide. But as the days passed, nobody stepped forward to report the incident. One of the only serious leads that the police could pursue was the missing automobile belonging to the Sumners. They disseminated the description of the vehicle throughout the state, and almost immediately they received a report of it. The automobile had been located. The abandoned vehicle was found in a small village in Florida, approximately 1 hour west of Jacksonville. Located off of a lonely dirt road, it had been parked in a fairly quiet place that was partially covered in trees. In spite of the fact that there was nothing contained within it, the detectives saw that the battery had been removed. The fact that this occurred prompted a few of the police to entertain the possibility that the Sumners had, in fact, just driven out from their residence for some reason and had merely gotten into some kind of car difficulty. In spite of the fact that it was a straightforward theory, it was one that would be totally disproved in under 5 hours' time. At that time, the Jacksonville police station was the recipient of a phone call that was really peculiar. It was asserted by the individual on the other end of the telephone that he was one Reggie Sumner. He stated that he had seen the news reports reporting that he and his wife had gone missing, and he wanted to make sure that everything was okay. He explained that everything was a giant misunderstanding, and that they had just gone away for a little while, but that they were fine and would be returning in a short while. When the police heard this call, they instantly became skeptical of the situation. In the first place, the man's voice was completely off. In spite of the fact that he was 61 years old, Reggie sounded like a young man. Simply put, the voice did not fit the bill. His tone, the nonchalant manner in which he discussed the entire scenario as if it were no great deal, was another thing that did not make sense. An officer who was on the line made the decision to put him through a test. When he asked the man, "Are you with your wife Carol?" the man who was on the phone said, "Yep, I'm with her. Here she is." After that, a lady picked up the phone and answered the question. She claimed to be Carol Sumner, but her voice was also much too youthful for her to be that person. Instead of sounding like a woman who was 61 years old, she sounded like she might be 18 or 19 years old. All she did was restate what the initial caller had stated, which was that everything was okay, that they had only been gone for a few days, and that there was no reason to be concerned about anything. She informed the authorities that they could cease their search for them. Subsequent to the conclusion of the call, the investigators were convinced. It is impossible for Carol and Reggie Sumner to be in this situation. In spite of this, they decided to call Rhonda in and have her listen to a recording of the conversation in order to reassure themselves completely. As soon as she became aware of the voices, she began to act without delay. She glanced at the officers and stated, "That's not my mom. And that's not Reggie." At this point, the police were operating under a new assumption that was quite unsettling. There is a high probability that the two young individuals who had called in purporting to be the Sumners were engaged in the disappearance of the young people. The investigation into the phone call was initiated without delay by the authorities in order to ascertain who the caller was and where the call originated from. During the time that they were waiting for those outcomes, they made the decision to look into another perspective. An investigation into the Sumners' financial records was carried out. Almost immediately, they came to the realization that their bank card had been used at an automated teller machine, ATM, in South Carolina, and that it had been used once they had been reported missing. The break was a significant one. They got in touch with the bank and asked for the footage from the security camera that was installed at the specific ATM at the time of the withdrawal. It was confirmed that their assumptions were correct when they obtained the footage and watched it. Neither Carol nor Reggie Sumner were the ones who took out the money. Some unknown young man, most likely in his early 20s, was the person in question. In the immediate aftermath of this finding, the results of the phone trace were returned. It did not lead anywhere. Under a fictitious name and at a fictitious address, the phone number was registered online. However, the trace was not a complete lost item. With its assistance, the authorities were able to obtain the full call logs from the phone. As they went through the records, they discovered that the person who had been using this mobile phone had recently made a call to a car rental firm that was located in South Carolina. As time went on, the parts began to come together. A call was placed to the rental firm, and the manager was contacted by the police. They were able to verify that a person who had called and rented a car using that mobile phone number had in fact completed the transaction. It was also found that the description of the hired car was identical to the description of the car that the unidentified man was driving on the security film of the ATM. Their getaway vehicle had been located by the cops. The car, however, had not been rented to a male customer. A woman had rented it out until that point. It was Tiffany Cole who was her name. Following then, the rental firm provided the authorities with yet another vital piece of information. Those satellite tracking systems were installed in each and every one of their vehicles. By utilizing this information, the law enforcement officials were able to monitor Tiffany's rental car in real time. Back in South Carolina, they followed the signal until they arrived at a motel. According to the detectives, their first idea, or at least their hope, was that it was possible that the Sumners were being held against their will in that hotel room. A group of law enforcement officers was assembled with a sense of urgency. 6 days after Carol and Reggie were officially reported missing, on the morning of July 14th, law enforcement officers arrived at the motel where they were staying. They proceeded to the front desk where they discovered the room in which Tiffany was registered, obtained a key, and then went up to the hotel. The door was opened when they made their presence known to the people within. There was no sign of the Sumners inside. The cops, on the other hand, discovered 3 young adults simply sitting there. Tiffany Cole, who was 24 years old at the time, was the individual who had hired the vehicle. She was accompanied by her lover, Michael James Jackson, who was 23 years old. Alongside them was his friend, Alan Wade, who was 19 years old at the time. The space was a complete mess, with dozens of shopping bags stuffed with items that had been acquired in the most recent time period. In addition to perfume, there were also brand new computers, video games, and pricey clothing. And in addition to all of the new things, the police discovered 2 very specific items: the key to the vehicle that Carol and Reggie Sumner owned, as well as Reggie Sumner's precious coin collection. These 3 individuals were hauled back to the station by the law enforcement officers, where they were placed in separate questioning rooms. Everyone who was engaged could not deny the fact that these 3 individuals were involved in the disappearance of the Sumners in some way. The key to their vehicle, their property, and the money that they possessed were all in their possession. Not only was it no longer the question for the police to establish a connection between them and the crime, but it was also the matter of how to convince them to reveal the location of Carol and Reggie. All 3 of them were first uncooperative with one another. On the other hand, they either refused to talk or denied having any knowledge. Tiffany began to show signs of weakness as a result of the protracted and intensive questioning. Although she conceded that they had looted the Sumners, she asserted that this was the only thing that they had done. There is nothing else. In addition to this, she informed them that there was a 4th individual who had been involved in the heist. This individual was a friend of Alan Wade's named Bruce Nixon, who was 19 years old. The police soon proceeded to Bruce's house, gathered him up, and brought him in for interrogation as well. Bruce was another person who resided in the neighborhood. On the other hand, in contrast to the other 3, Bruce gave in nearly entirely. He divulged all of his information to the authorities. And the account that he recounted, the reality about what happened to Carol and Reggie Sumner, was so horrifying that it caused a number of the experienced detectives who were engaged in the case to shed tears. From what he said, everything began with Tiffany. During the time when the Sumners were still residing in South Carolina, it was discovered that Tiffany had been next-door neighbors with them. Tiffany had a difficult childhood because her father was unable to recover from his illness. She was taken in by the Sumners, who, being the kind-hearted people that they were, had taken her under their leadership. They took care of her, developed a deep bond with her, and treated her in a manner that was almost identical to taking care of one of their own kids. They were always there for her whenever she required anything, whether it was money to buy food or simply someone to talk to. They were very supportive of her. Take, for instance, the fact that they sold an automobile to Tiffany in the year 2001, just prior to their relocation to Florida. However, they sold it to her for a price that was almost insignificant because they were aware that she was in desperate need of a car and that she did not have any money. They were exactly like that. Exactly 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was in Jacksonville, Florida, where she was partying with Michael James Jackson, who had recently become her boyfriend. After being kicked out of the residence they were residing in, they found themselves in a situation where they had nowhere else to go. They had been staying with some friends. They had no money, and they were unable to find a hotel. And it was at that moment that Tiffany's mind began to generate an idea. It was the Sumners that she recalled. She recalled that they had relocated to Jacksonville, and she recalled how they would continue to assist her in any situation regardless of the circumstances. As a result, the two of them arrived at the residence of the Sumners. They arrived in the middle of the night without prior notice and simply knocked on the door when they had arrived. Despite the fact that she was weary and bewildered when she arrived at the door, Carol's face lit up when she saw that it was Tiffany. She warmly embraced her and said, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long." "Come in, come in." "And who are you?" "Michael? It's great to meet you. Come on inside, I'll get you some food, we'll get you fed." "What do you need?" "What can we do for you?" Tiffany informed them that their preparations had been unsuccessful and that they did not have a place to stay for the night. She inquired as to whether or not I would be able to remain with them. Carol and Reggie answered, "Absolutely, no problem. You guys are our guests. You're welcome to stay as long as you want." That evening, Carol prepared a substantial lunch for them, and they all sat around the table talking. There was no hesitation in their language. During the course of their conversation, Carol and Reggie began discussing the possibility of selling their property in South Carolina, which they had previously owned. The fact that they had made a profit of $99,000 from the sale was something that they mentioned with a sense of pleasure and relief. Because of this, they were overjoyed because it meant that they would finally be able to retire in comfort and without any concerns regarding their finances. Tiffany and Michael exchanged a few fleeting glances with each other across the table as soon as those words left their mouths when they were sitting at the table. At that very instant, the germ of a dreadful notion was planted in the seed. They were well aware that they needed to return and rob them. Carol and Reggie were both up and about early the following morning. They brewed coffee and prepared a substantial breakfast in the expectation that Tiffany and Michael would remain for the duration of the day and spend additional time with them. Tiffany and Michael, on the other hand, were in a high rush to depart. They expressed their gratitude, informed them that they needed to get on the road, and then they went. Almost immediately after they got back into their vehicle, they began making plans. They started talking about how they were going to return, how they were going to rob the old couple who had just taken them in, and how they were going to get their hands on that $99,000. They were going to do all of these things. After a month had passed, on the evening of July 8th, they successfully put their plan into action. Following the completion of all of their preparations, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade arrived at the residence of the Sumners and knocked on the door. It was Carol who was there when the door opened. Both of the young men who were standing on her doorstep were individuals that she did not recognize. However, because she was the lovely and kind person that she was, she simply smiled and asked, "Hey boys, what can I do for you? How can I help you?" This was precisely what Tiffany had advised them to anticipate. She had been telling them that this pair would be very simple to take advantage of. An act of rehearsing was performed by Bruce and Alan for Carol. They informed them that their vehicle had broken down just a few blocks away and that they needed to use her phone in order to call for assistance. Despite the fact that Carol had some reservations, she ultimately decided to put her faith in the situation. That was her response. "Sure, come on in." Consequently, Bruce and Alan entered the house, and the entrance door closed behind them just as they entered. As soon as it was closed, one of them took out a fake gun and removed it from its cover. Although it was a replica, it appeared to be a terrifyingly real thing. At the same time that the other man was beginning to bind Carol with cord and duct tape, he displayed it to her. Carol began to scream, making as much noise as she could despite her discomfort. Reggie, who was outside in the garage and unable to see what was going on, was able to hear her cries in the distance. He rushed into the home to find out what was wrong, and as he entered, he ran right into the two men. They launched an assault on him right away. Because of his fractured leg and his fragile health, Reggie did not have a chance of winning. However, he was unable to put up much of a fight. In a short amount of time, both he and his wife were held on the couch in their living room and bound with tape. After that, their kidnappers put duct tape around their heads repeatedly until everything was covered, with the exception of a small gap that they cut under their nostrils so that they could breathe. While the couple was absolutely helpless, one of the men sent a text message to Michael, who was waiting just down the road with Tiffany inside the rented car. Michael was waiting for them right there. Text was easy to understand. It simply stated, "All clear." This was the indication that was given. It indicated that Michael might now aid them with the robbery by coming up to the house and assisting them. Tiffany did not leave the vehicle and remained there to serve as the watchman. Michael made his way up to the house, entered it, and then he, Bruce, and Ellen started to meticulously search through the house after he had entered. During the time that these three men were moving from room to room and removing all of their things, Carol and Reggie were undoubtedly thinking that despite how terrible this situation was, they would make it through. Following their departure, the men would take what they desired, and then they would feel better. However, once the three men had finished taking everything of worth, they came to a decision that altered the course of events permanently. A decision was made that they would also take Carol and Reggie with them. They lifted the hapless couple to their feet and marched them out into the garage as they emerged. After that, they compelled them to enter the trunk of their own vehicle. At this moment, Bruce departed from the residence of the Sumners, strolled down the road, and then re-entered the rental car with Tiffany. Michael and Alan entered the vehicle that belonged to the Sumners, and Carol and Reggie were secured inside the trunk. First, the two vehicles came together on the road, and then they started driving. Over the course of approximately 40 minutes, they traveled in a northwesterly direction, crossing the border into Georgia. They made a turn onto a road that was accessible only by a remote access, and continued driving down it until they reached a very distant part of the forest. It was not just a random location that they happened to find themselves in. This was a previous location that was chosen. When it was time to prepare it, Tiffany and the others had already been out to this very location 2 days before. Digging a grave was the action that they had taken in order to get it ready. The Sumners have a grave to mourn. Immediately adjacent to the newly excavated pit, Michael and Alan, who were driving the Sumners' automobile, arrived at the scene. Immediately behind them, in the rental car, Tiffany and Bruce reached their destination. After they had all come to a stop, they exited the vehicle and made their way to the rear of the Sumners' vehicle. They opened the trunk ajar with a pop. There is a strong possibility that the temperature within that black metal trunk was significantly higher than 100 Celsius. The moisture had caused the duct tape restraints that Carol and Reggie were wearing to become loose and slip off their wrists and faces. Carol and Reggie were drenched in sweat the entire time. The perpetrators of the crime discovered them sobbing and praying while holding on to each other when the trunk was opened. Following the realization that they were so feeble and afraid, the group came to the conclusion that they did not even require retaping their wrists or faces. There was no way that they were going to leave. They grabbed the two old individuals and yanked them out of the trunk, dropping them on the ground. They then walked away. It was most likely at this time when Carol and Reggie spotted the face of Tiffany among the four people who were holding them captive. I can only try to fathom the level of utter anguish that they must have experienced at that very moment. In the most heinous way that could possibly be imagined, this girl, the girl that they had taken in and thought of as a daughter, was betraying them. But there was no time to think about the betrayal that had occurred. Reggie was thrown to the side by Michael as soon as they were on the ground. Michael grabbed him and threw him around. The others grabbed Carol after he yelled at him, "Sit down and don't move. I'm going to kill you and your wife." After that, he continued to kill them. She was dragged away from her husband and brought to the edge of the open grave where she was laid to rest. They ripped the jewelry off of her body rather than putting it on. They pushed her into the hole after they had removed every single valuable item from the location. After that, they made their way back to Reggie, dragged him to the grave, and threw him and his wife into the grave simultaneously. Both of them rearranged themselves as soon as they were in the same grave together. Both of them were seated upright, with one of them in front of the other. Although she was behind Reggie, Carol threw her legs and arms around him, clinging to him for dear life. She was attempting to save her life. With tears in her eyes, she buried her face in his back and began to cry. It would appear that the initial plan was to simply utilize fear to coerce them into divulging all of their banking information. This was successful. During the time that Carol was crying into Reggie's back, Reggie began to beg the group for its assistance. Michael stepped forward and demanded they provide all of their ATM bank card numbers as well as their personal identification numbers, PINs. He pleaded with them, "Let me give you everything I have. Whatever you need, it's yours." And Reggie, who was adamant about preserving his own and Carol's lives, provided him with every piece of information that he could possibly provide. At this point, the group had effectively stolen everything of value that belonged to this unfortunate couple. Now that they had their possessions, they also had their financial information in their possession. Everything that they could possibly obtain from them was in their possession. Nevertheless, for some reason, that was not sufficient. The Sumners were the target of their decision to eliminate them. And they came to the conclusion that they had to carry it out in the most dreadful manner imaginable. Those individuals were going to be buried alive. Over the course of what must have seemed like an eternity, the group gradually, shovelful by shovelful, started to fill in the hole. Despite the fact that they were still at the bottom, Carol and Reggie were sitting together and pleading for their lives. Nevertheless, the group did not care. All they did was continue to shovel. The earth, which was dense and darkness, piled up around them. In a short amount of time, the muck and dirt had reached up to their necks. The enormous weight of it was pressing down on their chests, making it increasingly difficult for them to breathe. As Carol and Reggie became increasingly aware that they were being gradually crushed, their cries for assistance became more urgent, but they also became more distant from one another. Due to the fact that their breathing was so labored and it was really difficult for them to take a full breath, they were compelled to conserve their air. Due to the fact that the dirt was getting closer and closer to their mouths, they eventually had to tilt their heads upwards and make a concerted effort to take one last deep breath of breathe. On the other hand, once they did that, the murderers started hurling dirt directly onto their faces. They felt themselves choking and gagging as they breathed in the soil. Because of this, it became extremely difficult to take a breath. They were on their deathbed. After that, all of a sudden, an additional layer of dirt was thrown on top of them, and they vanished completely beneath the soil. In spite of this, the sounds continued. Despite the fact that more and more dirt was being piled on top of them, their whimpers and mumbled cries could still be heard. They were finally successful in filling in the hole. The backs of their shovels were used to begin compacting the dirt as they began their work. Furthermore, even at that time, they were still able to pick up on the faint sounds of the couple passing away beneath the ground. There was a slow, deliberate, and dreadful death that occurred. After they had finished their work, the murderers fled the location. They left the car belonging to the Sumners in the woods of Florida, where it was finally discovered after driving it back to Florida. After that, everyone poured into the rented car together. After driving straight to an automated teller machine, ATM, they took some of the Sumners' money out of the machine and then immediately went on a spending spree. There exists an image of Tiffany Cole that was taken just a few hours after she took part in this heinous deed. After she had killed the very folks who had taken her in and treated her like a dog, she is seen in the picture laughing and partying as if she had no concern in the world. The autopsy performed by the medical examiner revealed the whole tragedy of the Sumners' final moments, which was performed after the bodies of the Sumners were ultimately retrieved. Reggie and Carol both had dirt jammed into their nostrils, mouths, throats, stomachs, and deep within their lungs. They also had dirt packed into their abdominal cavities. Asphyxiation seems to be the true cause of death for them. However, they had been buried alive. Bruce Nixon was spared the death penalty in exchange for providing investigators with the complete truth and for directing them to the gravesite where Carol and Reggie were laid to rest. He received a sentence of life in prison. All three of the defendants, Michael Jackson, Alan Wade, and Tiffany Cole, were found guilty, and each of them was given a sentence of death. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? There is a strange part of human nature that makes us want to go exactly where we are told not to go. When we see a high fence, a locked gate, or a warning sign that says keep out, something inside of us gets incredibly curious. We start to wonder what is on the other side. Is it a beautiful view, a hidden secret, or something dangerous? For most of us, we look at the warning signs, we feel that little spark of curiosity, and then we turn around and walk away. We follow the rules because we know those rules are usually there to keep us safe. But some people cannot resist the temptation. They see the boundary as a challenge. They decide to step over the line, to push past the warnings, and to explore the forbidden zones. Today we are going to look at 3 stories of people who did exactly that. They went into places that were completely off limits, and they ended up facing consequences that were far more terrifying than any warning sign could ever describe. Our first story takes us to the beautiful island of Oahu in Hawaii. It was February 27th, 2015. An 18-year-old native Hawaiian named Ballen was visiting his grandmother. Dalen was an energetic young man who loved the outdoors. Even though he was native to Hawaii, he had not spent a lot of time on Oahu, so this trip was a special occasion. He wanted to make the most of his time there, and there was one specific adventure that he had been dreaming about for years. He wanted to climb the famous Haiku Stairs, which are also known to locals as the Stairway to Heaven. Now, the Stairway to Heaven is not your typical hiking trail. It is a highly dangerous, extremely narrow, and completely illegal pathway that climbs up the side of a massive mountain. The trail consists of nearly 4,000 steel steps that are bolted directly into the steep cliffs. It was originally built during World War II by the United States Navy so they could gain access to the top of this mountain where they had a secret radio station. After the war was over, instead of demolishing the steps, they allowed people to walk up and check out the view. But it was so dangerous and poorly maintained that they eventually closed it to the public starting in 1987. They literally put up a fence and put guards out to keep people from going in, and they handed out massive fines to anyone caught trespassing, but Dalen really wanted to do this. That morning, he told his grandmother that he was thinking about hopping the fence and making the hike. His grandmother immediately got worried. She told him that it was a horrible idea, explaining how dangerous the crumbling stairs were and warning him that he would be fined thousands of dollars if he got caught. Dalen backed down and told her that he would not go, playing it off like he had changed his mind. But sure enough, right after breakfast, he slipped out of the house, hopped on a bus, and made his way over to the base of these stairs. Even though it was totally illegal, he was so excited about the hike that he documented the whole trip by posting pictures of it to his social media. The first photo he posted showed him standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the massive mountain towering above him. He added a caption about how excited he was to finally start the hike. Over the next few hours, Dalen climbed higher and higher into the clouds. He kept taking photos and posting them online for his friends and family to see. Each picture showed the stunning dramatic drops on either side of the narrow metal stairs. He looked happy, full of energy, and completely fine. And then he kept climbing, taking more pictures as the stairs became steeper and more treacherous. But then, right around 11 o'clock that morning, the posting stopped abruptly. He had not reached the summit yet. You figure if you are going to do this hike and you are already posting pictures of the way up, certainly when you get to the summit, you are going to take a whole bunch of pictures and post those because that is the prize at the end. But for whatever reason, the posting stopped at 11 and he clearly had not reached the summit yet. By that night, when he did not come home, his family was really concerned and they notified the police. The police launched a huge search for him, looking all over the stairs. They had helicopters out, and even the Navy got involved, but there was absolutely no sign of him. He had just vanished. When they could not find him after several days, they had to call the search off. The assumption was that he simply slipped at some point and fell down the mountain, which is exactly why the stairs are off limits and not safe. But when people reviewed some of his last photos that he had posted to social media, they noticed something chilling. One shot looked like he was just taking a picture of the dense forest around the stairs. But if you look more closely, there is a man very clearly crouched down in the bushes a little ways down the trail who appears to be hiding. Many people believe that this man was following Ballen and at some point attacked him. They believe Ballen did not fall off the mountain, but was instead abducted or killed. To this day, Ballen has never been found, and that mystery man has never been identified. Now, let us travel to the most remote island in the world, which is Bouvet Island. It is an uninhabited 19 square mile chunk of rock and ice situated in the South Atlantic. If you were looking on a map and drew a 1,000-mile radius around Bouvet Island, there would be absolutely nothing else inside of it. There is no land, there is nothing. In fact, the nearest land is 1,100 miles away, and that is Antarctica, which is not permanently inhabited. The nearest permanently inhabited land is South Africa, and that is 1,600 miles away. The island is so far away from anything that in 1979, Israel and South Africa dropped 2 nuclear bombs near it, and nobody noticed. The only reason anyone found out is because a United States satellite happened to be looking in its direction and saw 2 bright flashes of light. For the very few people who have ever gone to Bouvet Island, you cannot just take a ship there because all around the edges of this island are these jagged ice cliffs and the water is treacherous. If you were to fall in, you would get sucked up underneath the rocks and you would be done for. So, nearly anyone who has stepped foot on Bouvet Island has taken a helicopter, which is a long, sketchy flight. Anyone who has been on the island only stays for a few minutes because they are worried about a storm rolling in, and the weather there is famously bad. Oh, and Bouvet Island is also an active volcano. It is a horrible place where nobody should go, but a few people still do. In 1964, British explorer Alan Crawford was sent out to Bouvet Island with a team of scientists to inspect the northwest corner of the island where a recent lava flow had created a flat shelf. The British wanted to build a weather station there, but they needed someone to go out and give the green light. On April 2nd, 1964, Crawford and his crew departed South Africa and began the long helicopter ride. When they finally touched down, everybody was on edge because they were in the most remote place in the world. The team immediately got to work surveying the site, while Crawford decided to step over the ridge for just a couple of minutes to look out at the island. He was fascinated with Bouvet Island and wanted to get a better look at it. He walked up this embankment and crested the hill, and as he looked down, he saw a little rocky alcove where there was a bit of a beach. And sitting in the shallow waters of this lagoon, he saw a wooden lifeboat that was half sunken. He could not believe it because he knew it was not theirs, and he was thinking how a boat could have gotten here at all when the nearest land was 1,100 miles away. He started walking down towards the beach and saw 2 wooden oars that went with the boat. Next to them was a flattened copper tank used to catch water, and next to that was a wooden barrel which would have been used to store water. He looked around for other signs of human life, but there were none. There was no tent, no clothes, and no human remains. He got down to the beach and waded into the water to inspect the lifeboat. He looked for identifying marks or numbers, but there were none. Because Crawford knew they had very little time, he ran back on shore, took a quick photo of the lifeboat with his camera, and then returned to his team. He told them what he had found, but his team was so focused on getting the survey done and getting out of there that they did not really care. They said it probably just washed up from some shipwreck and told him to forget about it. Crawford flew back to South Africa, showed the photo to his superiors, but they did not care either. 2 years later, another crew was sent to survey that same lagoon, but when they arrived, there was no boat, no barrel, no copper tank, and no oars. It was as if it was never there. We still do not know who was on that boat, how they got there, or where they went. In central Texas lies a stunning natural wonder called Jacob's Well. It is this beautiful, crystal-clear water spring that people love to visit every summer when the weather gets hot in Texas. People converge on Jacob's Well to enjoy swimming in the refreshing water, but it is not just for casual swimmers trying to avoid the heat. It is also for daredevils who strap scuba gear on and dive down through a 10-foot wide shaft that leads to one of the most intricate and dangerous underwater cave systems in the world. Jacob's Well is broken up into 4 distinct chambers, and as you move from one chamber to the next, it gets harder and harder to squeeze through the narrow spaces. Each of the chambers gets smaller and darker because you are losing sunlight, making them overall much more difficult to navigate. If you put on your scuba gear and hop into Jacob's Well, you swim straight down and reach the first chamber, which sits between 30 and 55 feet deep. In this first chamber, the sunlight still hits, so there is algae and wildlife, and this is where rookie scuba divers spend their time. At the bottom of the first chamber is another shaft opening, but it is much narrower, and this tunnel actually makes up the second chamber, bringing you down to 80 feet deep. Any diver in the second chamber has to be extremely aware of their surroundings on their ascent so they do not go down the false chimney. The false chimney is an opening that looks exactly like the main exit out of the second chamber, but it is a complete dead end. It loops around before hitting a solid rock wall, forcing you to go all the way back out, assuming you have enough air. The second chamber attracts intermediate divers, but it is very tight and claustrophobic. If you continue down past the 80-foot mark, there is a very tight squeeze that you can barely get through with your air tanks on. This brings you into a small room that is the third chamber. At this point, the sunlight is gone, and there is loose silt and gravel on the floor. If your fin so much as knocks it, the silt will float into the water and completely blind you. Generally speaking, only expert divers ever go into this third chamber. At the bottom of this chamber is a heavy metal grate that sits over a tiny little opening, which is the entrance to the infamous fourth and final chamber of Jacob's Well. No one can describe what it actually looks like inside the fourth chamber, because once you go in, it is impossible not to kick up a ton of silt, meaning you are going in blind. Furthermore, anyone who has successfully entered the fourth chamber has died there. There are literally deceased divers inside of the fourth chamber, and after about a dozen people died trying to get in there, they finally sealed it up with that heavy grate. But to go in, you have to remove your air tanks, push them ahead of you through the hole, and then slowly wriggle your way in while keeping the mouthpiece in your mouth. In 1983, 2 24-year-old college students named Richard Patton and Clark McConnell entered Jacob's Well around 8:30 in the evening. They were both highly experienced advanced scuba divers who had dived Jacob's Well before, and they wanted to check out the fourth chamber. They got in the water, went through the first chamber, continued into the second chamber, wriggled into the third chamber, and reached the grate. Using some equipment they brought with them, they were able to pry open the heavy grate. Richard Patton was the first one to go in. He removed his tanks, pushed them inside the opening, and began headfirst to slither inside the fourth chamber. Clark waited outside in the third chamber. But as soon as Richard made it inside, things went terribly wrong. Clark would later state that as soon as Richard got into the chamber, he came screaming back out of the opening. Clark realized that Richard did not have his mouthpiece in and did not have his scuba tanks on. He had dropped his gear in the pitch blackness and was desperately trying to wriggle his way out on a breath hold. Richard was reaching for Clark to pull him through the hole. As soon as Richard got free, Clark took his own mouthpiece off and jammed it into Richard's mouth. They began buddy breathing, sharing the single regulator back and forth as they made their way back up, leaving the lost equipment behind. They made it back into the third chamber and then into the second chamber, kicking desperately to reach the surface. But in their panic, their heads suddenly hit solid rock, and they realized they had gone up the false chimney. What was even worse was that they heard the empty hiss of their tank, meaning they were completely out of air. Clark, who had taken a full breath before the air ran out, turned and managed to swim out of the false chimney and make it to the surface before drowning. But Richard was not as lucky. His final moments were spent in total darkness, with the silt kicked up all around him with no air and no idea where to go. He desperately tried to swim up, but kept hitting the wall of the false chimney before ultimately drowning. When recovery divers went down to retrieve his body, they found him jammed up at the very end of the false chimney. When we look back at these three cases, we are left with a profound sense of mystery and a deep appreciation for the boundaries that exist in our world. It is easy to look at warning signs, fences, and closed gates as mere inconveniences designed to restrict our freedom, but the reality is much more sobering. These boundaries are often written in the history of tragic lessons learned by those who came before us. The lure of the forbidden is a powerful force in human psychology, drawing us toward the edges of the map and the depths of the unknown, but nature is completely indifferent to our curiosity. In the case of Dalen Pua, an ordinary trip to visit his grandmother turned into a parent's worst nightmare, leaving a family with a permanent void and a haunting question that may never be answered. Was Dalen simply a victim of the treacherous, crumbling steps of the Haiku Stairs, or did he cross paths with a predator who was using the illegal trail as a hunting ground? The image of the crouched figure in the bushes remains a chilling reminder that when we step off the beaten path, we leave behind the safety of society and enter a world where we are completely vulnerable. On Bouvet Island, the mystery of the abandoned lifeboat challenges our understanding of human survival. Who were the people who rowed a simple wooden boat across thousands of miles of the most hostile ocean on Earth only to land on a freezing volcanic rock? How did they manage to survive, and where did they go when the boat vanished? The complete lack of human remains or personal belongings on that icy beach suggests a story of quiet desperation, a struggle against the elements that was ultimately swallowed by the freezing wind and snow, leaving behind only a single photograph as proof that they were ever there. And at Jacob's Well, the tragic fate of Richard Patton shows us how quickly an exciting adventure can turn into a deadly trap. The false chimney stands as a physical manifestation of our worst fears, an illusion that promises safety but delivers only darkness and confinement. For the survivors, the guilt and the memories of those final desperate moments under the water are a heavy burden to carry, a constant reminder of how a single wrong turn in the dark can make the difference between life and death. Ultimately, these stories remind us to respect the limits of our own endurance and the rules that protect us, because once we step across that line into the forbidden, we are entirely on our own, and the earth does not always let us return. It makes you realize that sometimes the signs are there for a reason, and some secrets are simply meant to stay buried in the quiet, dark places where humans were never meant to go. And the scariest part is every single one of these people thought they would make it back. If you're not ready to sleep yet, there are more true mysteries waiting in the next video. On the 17th of February, 2004, inside a massive Japanese superstore called Jusco in Wakachi City, a loud commotion suddenly broke out. The store was always full of people, and on this cold winter afternoon, shoppers were going about their normal routines, looking at clothes, picking up groceries, and standing in checkout lines. But then, a sharp, screaming sound echoed from the front of the store near the bank of automated teller machines, or ATMs. Shoppers stopped in their tracks. They turned their heads toward the sound and saw something incredibly bizarre. There was a thin young woman with a very young baby, only about 1 or 2 years old, strapped tightly to her chest in a carrier. She was grappling and struggling with an older man. The crowd did not know what to make of it. They stood there, completely stunned, watching this older man and this young mother push and pull at each other in the middle of the store. The situation became much more intense when the woman pointed at the man and yelled out the word thief for everyone to hear. The man she was fighting with appeared to be in his late 60s. He had the woman pinned up against the bank of ATMs, and his fists were clenched tightly as if he was holding on to something valuable that he had just stolen from her. Seeing a young mother and her baby in danger, 3 men from the crowd immediately jumped into action. They ran forward and tackled the older man, wrestling him off of the woman and pinning him face down on the hard, cold tile floor. They began yelling at him to open his hands, trying to pry his fingers open to recover whatever it was he had taken from the young mother, but the man refused to unclench his fists. He fought back, squeezing his hands shut with incredible force. The 3 men realized they could not get him to cooperate on their own, so they yelled out to some police officers who happened to be nearby in the store. The officers ran over and quickly joined the struggle. They threw themselves on top of the older man, pulled his arms behind his back, and snapped handcuffs onto his wrists. All the while, the man was lying on the ground, crying out that he had done nothing wrong. He was pleading with them, but the police and the crowd were convinced he was a criminal who had tried to rob a mother and her baby. And then, as he lay pinned to the floor, his behavior took a very strange turn. Onlookers would later say he began to make odd, deep moaning sounds as if he were in severe pain. Before anyone could figure out what was happening, the man began to vomit violently on the floor. Right after that, his eyes rolled back into his head and he lost consciousness completely. The police immediately realized this was a major medical emergency and they called for an ambulance to take the man to the hospital. While they waited for the paramedics to arrive, the officers decided to finally open his clenched fist to see what he had stolen. They carefully pried his fingers open, expecting to find cash or a stolen wallet. But to their complete shock, the only thing the man was holding was his own bank card, which was now bent in 3 places from how hard he had been squeezing it. They searched his pockets and found his wallet, which belonged to him. They looked at the shopping bags scattered on the floor around him. The bags contained nothing but pet supplies that he had just purchased. There was absolutely nothing in his possession that belonged to anyone else. At this point, the police realized they needed to talk to the victim to find out what had actually happened. They looked up and started scanning the crowd for the thin young woman with the baby. But she was nowhere to be seen. In the absolute chaos of tackling the older man, handcuffing him, and dealing with his medical emergency, the officers had completely forgotten to keep an eye on her. They asked the onlookers if anyone knew who she was or where she had gone, but nobody had any answers. She had simply walked away while everyone was distracted by the older man on the floor. The police thought this was very unusual. Normally, a victim of an attempted robbery would stay to talk to the authorities and make a statement. But they assumed that since she had walked away, she must be fine and simply did not want to deal with the hassle of a police investigation. They officially labeled the incident as an attempted robbery, closed the case, and did not think much more of it. But the very next day, things took a tragic turn. The older man, who became known in police files as Mr. A, died at the hospital. The doctors determined that his heart had failed due to the extreme physical and emotional stress of the entire ordeal. When the police received this news, they simply went into their system, updated the file to show that the suspect was now deceased, and officially closed the investigation for good. But the family of Mr. A was absolutely devastated, and they refused to let this go. They could not believe the police's version of events. Mr. A was not a thief or a violent criminal. He was a gentle 70-year-old retiree who had spent 40 years working as a dedicated chemist for a major chemical manufacturing company. He was a man of science, order, and routine. Now he was collecting his pension and working a quiet part-time job as a security guard just to keep himself busy and active. He lived a very peaceful life with his wife, his children, and his grandchildren. He was a loving family man, and on the day of the incident, he had walked about 1 kilometer from his home to the Jusco store for a very simple reason. He wanted to buy some hamster food for his grandson's pet. The idea that this gentle, hard-working grandfather would suddenly decide to attack a young mother and steal from her in broad daylight made absolutely no sense to anyone who knew him. His family went to the police and pleaded with them to reopen the case. They insisted that the young woman must have done something to provoke the confrontation, and they wanted her found. The police initially resisted, wanting to keep the case closed, but the family was so persistent that the authorities finally agreed to review the security camera footage from the Jusco store. They wanted to make sure they had not missed anything, but they expected the footage would only confirm what the witnesses had reported. Instead, what they saw on the tape completely terrified them. The security camera overlooking the bank of ATMs had captured the entire incident from start to finish. When the detectives pulled up the footage, they decided to look at what happened before Mr. A even walked into the frame. They rewound the tape by about 5 minutes, and that is when they spotted the young woman. She was already standing in a corner just off to the side of the ATMs. She had the baby strapped to her chest, but she was not moving at all. She was standing completely still, with her back pressed against the corner, looking down at the floor. For 5 solid minutes, she did not move a single muscle, acting like a statue while shoppers walked past her. Then Mr. A walked into the frame. He carried several shopping bags on his arms containing the pet supplies he had bought. He walked up to one of the ATMs, inserted his card, withdrew some cash, and turned around to walk away. The very second his back was turned, the woman in the corner suddenly became animated. She lifted her head, walked directly toward him, and passed by him so closely that she skimmed her hand across his chest right where he had placed his money. As soon as she touched him, Mr. A had a sudden physical reaction. It was clear from the footage that he felt her hand on his chest and immediately suspected she was trying to pickpocket him. He instinctively reached out and grabbed her arm to stop her. That was the exact moment the struggle began, and that was when the woman began screaming that he was a thief. It was a brilliant, devious trap. She had deliberately touched him, waited for him to react, and then used the crowd's natural instinct to protect a mother and baby to turn them against him. The CCTV footage showed that the 3 men from the crowd then tackled Mr. A. The police arrived, and the chaotic struggle took place on the floor. While everyone was focused on the dying grandfather, the young woman simply stood up, adjusted the baby on her chest, and calmly walked into the crowd. She meandered through the shoppers and vanished. The police were stunned by this revelation. They realized that Mr. A was completely innocent and that this woman was a dangerous, calculated predator. They immediately launched an intensive search to identify her, reviewing every single hour of security footage from every camera inside and outside the Jusco store on that day. But the more they looked, the more baffled they became. Despite searching through dozens of camera angles, They could not find a single second of footage showing this woman entering the store. They also could not find any footage of her leaving the store after the incident. It was as if she had simply materialized in that corner next to the ATMs, waited for Mr. A, carried out her horrific plan, and then dissolved into thin air. Even though there were dozens of witnesses who had watched the entire struggle happen right in front of them in broad daylight, not a single person could provide a useful description of her face. It was like she was invisible, or like no one's eyes could focus on her details. The detectives desperately scrolled through the footage over and over again. Finally, after hours of searching, they found one tiny, crucial detail. For one single second, as she walked away from the ATMs, the woman looked directly up at one of the security cameras, exposing her face to the lens. But when the police zoomed in on her face, they were so unsettled by what they saw that they made a shocking decision. They decided to hide the image from the public. The police kept the image locked away for a full year. They were genuinely terrified that if the public saw her face, it would cause widespread panic, and people would be too scared to ever shop at the Jusco store again. The image was eventually leaked, and it is easy to see why they were so afraid. The woman's face is completely devoid of emotion. Her eyes are wide, blank, and staring downward, with no trace of human warmth or expression. Many people who have seen the image compare it to a death mask, which is a plaster cast taken of a dead person's face. Others say she does not even look like a living, breathing human being. After seeing the CCTV footage and realizing the truth, Mr. A's family was furious. They sued the police department for wrongfully detaining and pinning him to the ground while he was in obvious medical distress. The family eventually reached a financial settlement, but what they really wanted was justice and an explanation. They wanted to know who this woman was and why she had targeted Mr. A. But despite releasing her photograph to the public, no one ever came forward with any information. She was never identified, and because the statute of limitations for the case expired in 2011, she will likely never face justice. Today, the case is famously known in Japan as the Jusco Phantom, and it remains a massive mystery, with people still sharing her eerie photograph online and wondering who or what killed Mr. A. Our next story takes us to Sydney, Australia in the year 2010. At the center of this story is a 19-year-old college student named Sam Ballard. Sam was the kind of young man who seemed to have everything going for him. He was tall, athletic, handsome, and incredibly popular. He was a standout rugby player known for his strength, speed, and competitive spirit on the field. He played as a lock or a flanker, positions that required him to absorb heavy hits and keep moving forward. This physical dominance is what made him feel so invincible. To his friends, he was a natural leader, always ready with a joke or a smile. To his mother, Katie, Sam was her pride and joy. She would often describe him as being completely invincible, like nothing in the world could ever hurt him. He had a bright future ahead of him, with dreams of finishing college, continuing his rugby career, and seeing where life would take him. He was surrounded by a solid group of loyal friends who spent almost all their free time together, constantly laughing, playing sports, and looking for new adventures. One weekend night, Sam and his closest friends gathered at a classmate's house for what they jokingly called a red wine appreciation night. This was a running, sarcastic joke among the group. They were all 19-year-old college boys who normally drank cheap beer and hung out in messy rooms. But on this night, they decided it would be hilarious to pretend to be sophisticated high society adults. They bought several cheap bottles of red wine from a local liquor store, poured them into fancy glasses, and walked around the house speaking in mock serious voices, pretending to discuss the complex flavors and notes of the wine. It was a night filled with endless laughter, joking, and lighthearted fun. After a few hours of drinking and teasing each other, the group decided to step out onto the backyard concrete patio to enjoy the cool night air. Earlier that afternoon, it had rained heavily, leaving the ground damp and bringing out many of the small garden creatures. They stood around in a circle on the patio, still laughing and talking about their lives, when one of the boys looked down at the concrete floor and noticed something crawling slowly near his shoe. It was a small, common garden slug about 2 inches long. It was slowly making its way across the concrete patio, leaving a thin, shiny trail of slime behind it. The boys stopped their conversation and crowded around to look at the little creature. At this point, the combination of alcohol, youthful energy, and a desire for entertainment took over. One of the boys looked up, grinned, and yelled out that someone in the group should eat the slug. It was a classic, silly dare, the kind of thing teenage boys say all the time when they are hanging out. Nobody took him seriously at first. Everyone just laughed and started joking about how disgusting it would be, pointing fingers and asking who was brave enough to do it. But Sam Ballard was not the type of person to back down from a challenge. He was a competitive rugby player who loved being the center of attention and proving his toughness to his buddies. He looked at his friends, smiled, and told them that he would do it. He said he would eat the slug right then and there. His friends immediately started shouting, telling him there was no way he was actually going to do it. They dared him, laughing and egging him on, saying he was all talk. But their disbelief only made Sam more determined. He wanted to show them that he was completely fearless. He leaned down, carefully picked up the cold, slimy slug with his fingers, and held it up for everyone to see. His friends watched in disbelief, some of them laughing, others groaning in disgust. Without hesitating any further, Sam tossed the slug into his mouth and swallowed it whole. He did not chew it, he just let it slide down his throat with a big gulp of red wine. For a second, there was stunned silence, and then the backyard erupted into wild cheers and laughter. His friends couldn't believe he had actually done it. They clapped him on the back, calling him a legend and the king of the party. For the rest of the night, Sam was the hero of the evening, and they all continued to drink wine and laugh about the crazy stunt. Sam went home that night feeling completely fine, proud of his silly victory. The next morning, however, things began to change. When Sam woke up, he felt a strange, dull ache in both of his legs. It was a persistent, throbbing pain that made it difficult for him to walk comfortably. At first, Sam did not worry about it. He assumed it was just a normal part of his hangover, or maybe some muscle strain from a tough rugby training session he had done earlier in the week. He figured that if he drank plenty of water, ate a good meal, and rested for the day, the pain would eventually fade away. But as the hours passed, the foggy feeling of his hangover began to disappear, but the heavy ache in his legs did not. In fact, by the time evening arrived, the pain had actually started to get worse. It felt deeper, like it was coming from his bones rather than his muscles. He tried to do some light stretching in his room, but his legs felt heavy and unresponsive. He decided to go to sleep, hoping that a full night of rest would cure whatever was going on. But the following morning, when Sam woke up, the pain was not only still there, it had intensified significantly. He could barely stand up without feeling a sharp, burning sensation in his lower limbs, as if hot needles were being pressed into his calves and thighs. At this point, he realized that this was not a normal hangover symptom or a sports injury. He decided to sit down with his mother, Katie, and explain what he was feeling. When Katie heard about the severe, unexplained leg pain, her heart sank. She was instantly gripped by a deep, terrifying fear. Sam's father had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, which is a debilitating chronic disease that attacks the central nervous system. Katie had watched her husband struggle with this disease for years, seeing him slowly lose his mobility and strength. One of the early signs of multiple sclerosis can be severe, unexplained nerve pain and weakness in the legs. Because the disease can have a genetic component, Katie immediately worried that her young, athletic son was developing the very same condition that had affected his father. Sam was also worried about this possibility, but as they talked, he remembered the party from 2 nights ago. He looked at his mother and told her about the dare. He explained that he had eaten a garden slug on a whim, and he wondered out loud if the leg pain could be some kind of unusual allergic reaction to the slug. Katie tried to calm his nerves. She told him that he had nothing to worry about when it came to the slug. She said that nobody gets sick from eating things like that, and that it was likely just a coincidence. Still, they both knew they needed answers, so they scheduled an appointment to see a doctor right away. At the clinic, the doctor listened to their concerns and immediately ordered a series of tests to check for multiple sclerosis. A short time later, the results came back, and multiple sclerosis was completely ruled out. It was a massive, overwhelming relief for both Sam and his mother. But the relief was short-lived, because the doctor admitted that he had absolutely no idea what was actually causing Sam's severe leg pain. Sam brought up the slug again, explaining the dare and asking if it could be related. The doctor admitted that off the top of his head, he had never heard of a slug causing leg pain, but he promised to look into it. A few days later, the doctor called Sam back to the clinic. He had done extensive research, consulted with several of his medical colleagues, and finally had an answer. And the answer was incredibly alarming. The doctor explained that Sam had contracted a very rare condition called rat lungworm disease. He explained that this disease is caused by a parasitic worm called Angiostrongylus cantonensis. This parasite primarily lives inside the lungs of rats. The rats pass the larva of the parasite in their feces. Snails and slugs then crawl over the feces and consume it, which makes them carriers of the active parasite. The doctor explained that most humans who get this disease contract it by eating raw or undercooked snails, and in most cases, they experience mild symptoms and recover fully once the parasite dies off naturally. But then, the doctor delivered the terrifying catch. In very rare, severe cases, the parasite does not just stay in the digestive system. Instead, it can penetrate the walls of the intestines, enter the bloodstream, and travel through the nervous system. From there, it can burrow its way directly into the outer lining of the brain, causing a highly dangerous and rare form of meningitis. By this time, Sam's symptoms were getting much worse. The pain in his legs was now accompanied by constant severe dizziness and violent, uncontrollable vomiting. The doctor told Sam and Katie that there was no specific cure or medical treatment for rat lungworm disease. The medical team could only provide basic care to manage his symptoms, and they would simply have to wait and see how severe his specific case would turn out to be. They hoped his body would fight it off, but unfortunately, Sam's body was facing an uphill battle against a relentless parasite. Just a few days after receiving his diagnosis, Sam's condition took a drastic turn for the worse. The parasite had indeed reached his brain, and he developed the rare, severe form of meningitis the doctor had warned them about. His brain began to swell, and his body could no longer handle the infection. Sam slipped into a deep, silent coma. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. His mother, Katie, and his friends took turns sitting by his bedside in the hospital, watching the machines keep him alive, praying for any sign of movement or recovery. They decorated his room with photos of him playing rugby and left his favorite sports jerseys nearby, trying to keep his spirit alive. They refused to give up hope, holding his hand and talking to him, hoping he could hear them. In total, Sam remained trapped in that coma for 420 days. It was an agonizing, long year of uncertainty for everyone who loved him. And when he finally opened his eyes and woke up, the reality of his condition was heartbreaking. Sam was alive, but the disease had completely ravaged his body. He was entirely paralyzed, unable to move his arms, legs, or torso. He had lost the ability to speak, and because he could no longer swallow, he required a feeding tube to stay alive. He now needed intensive 24-hour medical care 7 days a week just to perform the most basic human functions. But the most devastating part of his condition was his mental state. The disease had destroyed his motor functions, but it had left his cognitive abilities completely untouched. He was just as sharp, intelligent, and aware as he had been on the night of the party. He was fully conscious of what had happened to him, fully aware of his paralyzed body, and completely trapped inside a silent frame, unable to communicate his thoughts to the outside world. One of his best friends, Jimmy Galvin, who had been there on the night of the Red Wine Appreciation Night, came to visit Sam shortly after he woke from his coma. Jimmy walked into the hospital room, looked at his once strong, athletic friend sitting helplessly in a bed, and was overcome with emotion. Jimmy sat down next to him, looked into Sam's eyes, and began to apologize. He wept as he told Sam how incredibly sorry he was that he had not done more to stop him from eating the slug that night. He blamed himself for not knocking it out of his hand before he could swallow it. Even though Sam could not move a single muscle in his face or make a sound, as Jimmy spoke, tears began to pool in Sam's eyes and roll down his cheeks. It was a clear, heart-wrenching sign that Sam could hear him, that he understood every single word, and that he shared the deep, painful regret of that fateful night. Eventually, 3 years after he was first admitted to the hospital, Sam was allowed to return home. He was placed in a specialized motorized wheelchair, and his family dedicated their lives to making him as comfortable as possible. He would survive for another 5 years at home, showing incredible resilience and strength before the long-term complications of the brain infection finally claimed his life. Throughout those 8 difficult years of living with his severe disabilities, Sam always kept one specific item very close to his side. It was a copy of the classic Dr. Seuss book, Oh, the Places You'll Go. This was the final book written by Dr. Seuss and its pages offer words of encouragement and hope to people facing the unpredictable, difficult obstacles of life. Over the years, whenever Sam was struggling or feeling down, his family and friends would sit with him and read from this book, using its simple, powerful messages to help him find the strength to keep fighting. When Sam finally passed away at the age of 28, his loved ones gathered at his funeral, and the book was read aloud to him one last time as they said their final goodbyes. Our final story begins in California, with a young boy named Conrad Rowland. From the moment he was old enough to walk, Conrad was a child who was constantly on the move. He had an incredible, almost endless amount of energy, and he was always running, jumping, and exploring his surroundings. This made things very difficult for his mother, Mary, who found it nearly impossible to keep track of her hyperactive son. One afternoon, while they were at the local grocery store together, Conrad managed to slip away from his mother's side in the blink of an eye. Mary looked around, realizing he was gone, and began to search the aisles in a panic, calling out his name. After several terrifying minutes, she finally heard a faint sound coming from the frozen food aisle. She ran over, opened up one of the large commercial display freezers, and there he was. 4-year-old Conrad had climbed completely inside. He was sitting on a cold shelf, surrounded by frozen food, stuck and unable to get out on his own. After that frightening incident, Mary realized she had to find a creative way to keep track of her son so he wouldn't get hurt. She decided to go to a craft store and buy several small metal bells. She then took those bells and attached them securely to the laces of Conrad's shoes. From that day on, whenever they went out in public, Conrad wore his bell shoes. Wherever he ran, the bells would ring loudly, letting his mother know exactly where he was at all times, even if he slipped out of her sight. This simple trick worked perfectly, but as Conrad grew older, his boundless energy did not fade. Fortunately, by the time he was 4 years old, he discovered the world of sports. Instead of using his energy to run away from his mother in grocery stores, he began to channel all of his speed and focus into athletic activities. He fell in love with baseball, basketball, soccer, and tennis, practicing them constantly. By the time Conrad was 11 years old, he had developed into an exceptional, standout, all-around athlete. He was faster, stronger, and more focused than almost any other kid his age. Around this time, his school announced that they were going to hold a special assembly for the students, and they had invited a very special guest speaker. That speaker turned out to be none other than the legendary Hall of Fame baseball player, Rod Carew. Conrad sat in the crowded school gymnasium, completely mesmerized. He could not believe that he was sitting in the same room as an actual professional athlete, let alone someone who had achieved the incredible historic success that Rod Carew had. As he listened to the baseball legend speak about dedication, hard work, and achieving dreams, a spark was lit inside of Conrad. When the assembly ended and he got home that afternoon, he could not stop talking about meeting Mr. Carew. He looked at his mother and told her with absolute certainty that he was going to grow up to be a professional athlete just like Rod Carew. For many young children, a moment like that would have been a passing phase. They would be excited about sports for a few weeks, and then their interests would shift to video games, music, or other hobbies. But the impression that Rod Carew left on 11-year-old Conrad was incredibly profound. He never wavered in his goal. He dedicated his entire teenage life to training, practicing, and perfecting his skills. He stayed focused, avoided distractions, and worked harder than anyone else. His dedication paid off in a massive way, although his success came in a different sport. Instead of baseball, Conrad became an exceptional football player. He was so talented that he eventually made it all the way to the NFL, the National Football League. By the year 2012, Conrad was living his dream, starting nearly every single game for the New York Jets at the highly demanding position of tight end. It seemed like his professional career was taking off perfectly, and his future was brighter than ever. But the life of a professional athlete is full of unpredictable challenges, and in 2013, disaster struck. During a game, Conrad suffered a severe, devastating knee injury. The injury was so bad that it completely sidelined him, keeping him off the football field for about 2 years. It was a massive mental and physical blow, but Conrad refused to let his dream end there. He entered into a grueling, daily physical rehabilitation program. He spent hours in the gym, pushing his body to its absolute limits, working through intense pain to rebuild the strength in his knee. Eventually, through sheer determination, he managed to get back to full strength and peak physical condition. But the problem was that NFL teams were now hesitant to sign him. They were worried that his knee was a ticking time bomb and would simply give out again under the pressure of a real game. Conrad refused to give up hope, continuing to train extremely hard in the hopes of landing another contract, but his professional playing career was starting to look bleak. During the offseason of 2016, Conrad decided to take a break from his intense training schedule and travel back home to California to visit his family. One quiet evening, his mother, Mary, was in the kitchen preparing dinner for everyone. Conrad was sitting nearby at the kitchen table, filling out some paperwork to renew his California driver's license. As he read through the form, he came to a section that asked him if he wanted to register as an organ donor. Conrad paused, looked up at his mother, and asked her if she was registered as an organ donor. Mary stopped what she was doing, looked at her son, and replied that yes, she was indeed an organ donor. Conrad smiled, nodded, and said that if she was a donor, then he would be one too. He took his pen and firmly checked the box to register. Mary remembers looking at her healthy, strong, athletic son in that moment, and a sudden, quiet thought crossed her mind. She thought about how much she loved him, and she silently hoped that his decision would never actually have to be put to the test. A few months after that conversation, Conrad was back in the gym, working out, and preparing his body for the upcoming football season. He was lifting weights and running drills when, completely out of nowhere, he felt a strange, physical click inside of his head. This click was immediately followed by a sudden, blinding, and agonizingly painful headache. The pain was so intense that it was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. It was concentrated right behind his left eye. Conrad realized immediately that he could not continue his workout. He stepped away from the equipment, sat down, and called his mother. He explained the strange click and the terrible pain. Mary was instantly alarmed by his symptoms. Conrad followed her advice and drove himself to the UCLA Medical Center. There, the doctors ran a series of rapid scans and delivered a terrifying diagnosis. Conrad had a brain aneurysm. The doctors explained that a brain aneurysm is a weak, bulging spot in the wall of a blood vessel inside the brain, which fills with blood. If the aneurysm remains intact, it can sometimes be treated, but if it bursts, it is fatal about 50% of the time. For those lucky enough to survive a rupture, they are almost always left with severe, permanent neurological damage. Despite the terrifying news, Conrad remained incredibly positive and strong. He was a professional athlete used to facing tough opponents, and he assured his worried family that he was going to fight this condition and win. He stayed in the hospital under close observation, but on December 12, just 4 days after he had been admitted, the worst-case scenario happened. Conrad's aneurysm suddenly burst. He lost consciousness instantly and never woke up. The medical team rushed to save him, but the damage to his brain was too severe. Conrad was declared brain dead. Because Conrad had checked that box on his driver's license just a few months earlier, his family knew exactly what his wishes were. They agreed to let the doctors keep his body on life support so that his organs could be harvested and donated to save the lives of others. The hospital staff immediately began contacting the people at the very top of the organ donor recipient lists. One of those calls went to a man in his 70s who was living in the Los Angeles area. A year earlier, this man had suffered a massive, devastating heart attack that had left his heart severely damaged. He was in end-stage heart failure, and his doctors had made it clear that he was running out of time. He desperately needed a new heart to survive. When the man and his wife received the phone call from the hospital saying a matching heart was available, they were overcome with emotion. They were shaking with disbelief, knowing that a miracle was about to save his life. They immediately got into their car, rushed to the UCLA Medical Center, and the man was prepped for surgery. A few hours later, the doctors emerged from the operating room with wonderful news. The heart transplant had been a complete, flawless success. The man's body had accepted the new heart, and he was going to make a full recovery. But the most incredible part of this story was the identity of the man whose life had just been saved by Conrad's heart. It was none other than the legendary Baseball Hall of Famer, Rod Carew. The very same man who had inspired an 11-year-old Conrad to dedicate his life to becoming a professional athlete was now alive because Conrad had made the selfless decision to check that organ donor box on his driver's license. At first, neither family had any idea about the connection due to strict medical privacy laws. But eventually, the unique details of the donor and the recipient allowed them to discover the truth. When the two families learned about this unbelievable connection, they immediately reached out to one another. They met, and they instantly formed a deep, emotional, and permanent bond. Today, because Conrad's family lives only 12 miles away from Rod Carew and his family, they have become an extended family of sorts. Rod and his wife have given Conrad's mother, Mary, a permanent standing invitation to visit their home whenever she wants. Mary often takes them up on this offer. She will walk into their home, greet the man who was once her son's hero, and sit down next to him. She will then place a stethoscope against Rod Carew's chest, close her eyes, and listen to the steady, strong beating of her son's heart, continuing to bring life to the man who had inspired him so many years ago. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. For nearly 10 years, a brutal murder sat unsolved, not because there were no suspects, not because there were no clues, but because the most important piece of evidence was misunderstood. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't lost. It was right there in plain sight. And when investigators finally realized what it meant, it didn't just point to a killer, it exposed something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. But it would take nearly a decade and the help of a secretive group of elite crime solvers to finally see it for what it really was. If you're drawn to stories that are strange, dark, and deeply unsettling, then you're in the right place. Let's get into it. When classes began at Drexel University in Philadelphia on the cold morning of the 30th of November 1984, the campus was buzzing with its usual energy. Students were rushing to get to their classrooms, shivering in the chilly autumn air. But as some of those students were walking into Randall Hall, they made a gruesome discovery that would change the university forever. Crumpled at the bottom of an outdoor stairwell, hidden underneath a heavy gray jacket, was the body of a young woman. Her face was covered in deep cuts and severe bruising, showing that she had been brutally beaten. Around her neck, there was a deep, dark purple line where she had been strangled to death. She had no purse, no backpack, and absolutely nothing on her person to identify who she was. She was fully clothed, and there was no immediate evidence of sexual assault, but there was one very bizarre detail that stood out. She was completely missing her shoes and her socks. Her bare feet were exposed to the freezing air. The police were called to the scene immediately. They cordoned off the entire outdoor stairwell with yellow tape and began their investigation. Their very first suspicion was that this was a simple robbery that had turned deadly. But right away, the police knew they were in for a very difficult investigation. The first major hurdle was that there were absolutely no security cameras inside or outside of Randall Hall. This meant they could not just review footage to see who had been walking around the building. The second major hurdle was that Drexel University was not an isolated, closed-off campus. Its buildings were completely integrated into the urban streets of West Philadelphia. Randall Hall itself was located right along a known cut-through path that local residents used almost every single day to walk through the neighborhood. This meant there was a virtually unlimited number of potential suspects. To make matters worse, as the investigators analyzed the scene, it became very clear that this young woman had not been killed in this stairwell. She had been killed somewhere else and then dragged a great distance to this spot. The dragging process was likely how she lost her shoes and socks. The killer had then dumped her body at the bottom of the stairs and covered her with her own gray jacket. But just a couple of hours after the body was discovered, the police received a very lucky break. A young man who was incredibly combative and frantic rushed toward the closed-off crime scene. He was trying to push his way past the officers and demanded that they let him through because he said he knew the identity of the dead girl. The police were immediately suspicious of this. They had not released any details to the public, and they had not even identified the victim themselves. They pulled the young man aside and began interviewing him. He told the police his name was Kurt Rayner, and he was a student at Drexel. He said he believed the dead girl was his girlfriend, 20-year-old Debbie Wilson, who was also a student. He then proceeded to give the police a very long and highly complicated explanation of how he had figured out the identity of the victim. Kurt said that the night before, he had been with Debbie in the computer lab located in the basement of Randall Hall. He explained that Debbie had a massive project due the next day, and he had offered to keep her company while she worked on it. But by about 1:30 inches the morning, Debbie still had a lot of work left to do. Kurt said he was just incredibly tired and did not think he could stay awake any longer. So, he asked Debbie if it would be okay if he went back to his dorm early. Debbie told him it was totally fine. She was used to working late in the computer lab and felt perfectly safe. Kurt said that even though he wanted to stick around and walk her safely to her car when she was done, he felt like she would be okay, so he took off on his own. On his walk back to the dorm, Kurt said he passed by a campus security guard. He actually stopped and asked the guard if he would mind checking on his girlfriend in the basement computer lab because she was all alone and it was very late. The security guard told him it was no problem and that he would make sure she was okay. The next morning, when Kurt woke up, he heard rumors from other students about a young woman's body being found outside Randall Hall and that it looked like a murder. Kurt said he did not think much of it at first. But later that day, when he went to campus to meet up with Debbie, he saw her car still parked in the computer lab parking lot, looking like it had never moved. And then, when he arrived at their designated meeting spot, Debbie never showed up. He said it was at that exact point that he realized the dead woman in Randall Hall had to be Debbie. And he was not wrong. It was indeed Debbie. But the police were absolutely not buying his story. He was the last person known to have seen Debbie alive. And by his own admission, he had heard that morning about a dead woman being found at the very place he had left his girlfriend all alone, yet he waited hours before bringing this up to anyone. The police also noticed something highly alarming on his hands. Kurt had fresh bruises on his knuckles and a deep cut between his fingers. Suddenly, Kurt seemed like the primary suspect. The nature of the crime suggested a deeply personal motive. Strangulation is a highly intimate act. The killer is almost always face-to-face with their victim, and it requires a massive amount of physical strength and rage to complete. Afterward, the killer had covered Debbie's body with her own jacket, which is an act that investigators know indicates remorse, guilt, or respect for the victim. Generally, when a young woman is murdered, her romantic partner is the very first suspect. But instead of tipping Kurt off that they were focusing on him, the detectives told him to go back to his dorm room and that they would be in touch with him as the investigation developed. In the meantime, the investigators turned their attention to the computer lab in the basement of Randall Hall. They found the computer that Debbie had been using. She had logged in to start her project, but had never logged out. Her computer cursor was left blinking mid-sentence. The timestamp of her last activity was exactly 1:38 a.m., just 8 minutes after Kurt said he left her. This led investigators to believe she was interrupted by her attacker inside the lab. As they swept the room, they found 2 extension cords on the floor near her computer that perfectly matched the ligature marks on Debbie's neck. They also found a small spot of blood on the back of Debbie's chair, which they carefully collected and sent off for testing. But as the police looked around the lab, they realized they had suffered a massive setback. The computer lab and the hallway right outside looked incredibly neat and clean. It turned out that the university janitor had cleaned the entire area earlier that morning, likely destroying critical physical evidence without realizing a crime had been committed. The police interviewed the janitor, who had a rock-solid alibi, and was devastated to learn she had cleaned a crime scene. When asked if she noticed anything strange, she said everything seemed normal, but she did recall that the tables and chairs inside the lab had been moved and pushed around. She had not thought much of it because students often moved the furniture while studying. Because the police lacked any physical evidence, they could not arrest Kurt. Instead, they asked him to come down to the station for a formal interview. During the questioning, Kurt vehemently insisted he had nothing to do with Debbie's death. As for the bruises and the cut on his hand, he claimed he had punched a concrete wall in a fit of grief after finding out what had happened to Debbie. He said the cut between his fingers was from working on his car a few days earlier. Since neither of those statements could be disproven, and they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, the police had to let him go. They then began digging deeper into his alibi. Kurt had told them that he passed a security guard on his walk back to his dorm and asked him to check on Debbie. The police tracked down that security guard, whose name was Bryce Clapman. Clapman was a longtime employee of Drexel with a stellar work record and no criminal history. Clapman completely confirmed Kurt's story. He said he spoke with Kurt around 1:30 inches the morning. After their conversation, Clapman used his radio to contact Bronson Ziegler, who was one of the 2 security guards working inside Randall Hall that night. Clapman told Ziegler that he or the other guard on duty, David Dixon, needed to go down to the basement and check on the girl. Clapman also mentioned that shortly after making that call, he saw a figure, presumably a student, walking outside Randall Hall. He said it was too dark and he was too far away to see any features, but he definitely saw someone walking around the premises around 1:30 a.m. Clapman stated he never went inside Randall Hall that night and volunteered to take a lie detector test. The police then ran background checks on the two guards who were inside Randall Hall, Bronson Ziegler and David Dixon. Dixon was a military veteran with a pristine record who was still active in the Army Reserves. Ziegler, however, had a much darker past. It turned out he had spent time in jail for burglary and had actually lied about his criminal record to get his job as a security guard. When police interviewed Ziegler, he was incredibly evasive, defensive, and frustrated. He admitted he received the message from Clapman to check on the girl, but said he did not feel like doing it himself. So, he claimed he radioed Dixon and told him to go do it instead. Ziegler insisted he had performed his security rounds properly. He told detectives they could check his security clock. This clock was a device that guards carried with them, which required them to insert keys located at designated stations along their route, stamping a physical card with the exact time of their arrival. When the police checked Ziegler's punch card, it showed he had hit all his stations at the correct times. But the detectives knew this did not clear him, as there was plenty of time in between his rounds to commit the crime. Toward the end of his interview, Ziegler became angry and sarcastically told detectives that yes, he killed Debbie, and then flatly refused to take a lie detector test. When the police interviewed David Dixon, he gave a completely different account. He said Ziegler had never radioed him and had never asked him to check on the girl in the computer lab. However, Dixon did say he was aware someone was working late. He explained that around 2:15 inches the morning, he walked past the basement lab, saw the lights on, and heard the loud sound of printers working inside. Not wanting to disturb whoever was in there, he did not look inside. He said he spent the next couple of hours talking on the phone with his girlfriend. Then, around 4:0 inches the morning, he went back to the lab. The lights were off and the door was locked, so he assumed they had finished and left and that Ziegler had locked up. When asked why neither he nor Ziegler had discovered Debbie's body, Dixon explained that their security rounds did not extend outside the building, so they never would have seen her in the outdoor stairwell. At this point, Bryce Clapman and David Dixon were ruled out as suspects, but Bronson Ziegler became their primary focus. However, just like with the boyfriend Kurt, there was no physical evidence tying Ziegler to the crime, so they could not arrest him. The investigators decided to try and identify the mysterious person Clapman had seen walking around Randall Hall at 1:30 a.m. After conducting interviews, they discovered it was a 28-year-old PhD student named Ashlyn Berhard. Berhard was known for keeping very long hours in his office, which happened to be located directly above the outdoor stairwell where Debbie was found. But he was also known for some highly disturbing behavior. Several female secretaries in his department reported that Berhard had a habit of creeping up behind them and suddenly holding a sharp pencil to their necks, threatening to kill them. When interviewed, Berhard admitted he was in Randall Hall that night, but claimed he did not know Debbie and had not left his office all night. He agreed to take a lie detector test, but failed it. When confronted, he scrambled for an explanation and named 2 other graduate students who could provide an alibi. But when police spoke to those students, they said Berhard had left the office around 1:0 inches the morning and was gone for about 3 hours. Berhard then claimed he had simply forgotten to mention that he left to take a nap in one of the study rooms, and that it was just a coincidence his nap coincided with the murder. The detectives did not believe him, but once again they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime. The police continued to look for other suspects. They began speaking to Debbie's friends, and that is when they learned that Debbie had a stalker. It was another student named Alan Smith. Alan had been a close friend of Debbie's, but when he tried to make the relationship romantic, Debbie rejected him. Alan did not take it well. He began following Debbie around campus, trying to force her to talk to him. Just the day before Debbie was killed, friends had witnessed a massive fight between them in the middle of campus, where Alan had grabbed Debbie's shoulder, shook her, and screamed in her face. The police tracked Alan down, but he had no alibi, claiming he was alone in his apartment. Like all the other suspects, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. Around this time, the lab results from the small spot of blood found on the back of Debbie's chair finally came back. Since DNA profiling did not exist in 1984, the lab could only determine the blood type. The test showed the blood was type A. Debbie's blood was type O, meaning this drop of blood almost certainly belonged to her killer, who must have been cut during the struggle. The police immediately obtained blood samples from Kurt Rayner, Bronson Ziegler, Ashlyn Bearhard, and Alan Smith. They were confident that one of them would be type A. But when the results came back, not a single one of them had type A blood. It was a crushing blow to the entire investigation. With no suspects left, the case began to stall. A wave of panic swept through the Drexel University campus. Students were outraged by the lack of security and demanded that guards be allowed to carry weapons. The university offered a $10,000 reward, and the president advised everyone to use the buddy system, stating he believed the killer was likely someone from their own community. No one could understand why anyone would target Debbie. She was a wonderfully kind young woman who worked incredibly hard. She had modeled in high school, but was not vain, even turning down braces because she was worried it would ruin her clarinet playing. She kept a picture of a Mercedes-Benz above her desk to keep herself motivated. That picture was still hanging there after she was gone. Her hard work had put her in danger that night, as she was determined to stay as late as necessary to finish her project. The physical evidence they did have did not seem to make sense. It did not appear to be a simple robbery. While she was missing her shoes and socks, she was still wearing an expensive watch. About a week after the murder, her backpack mysteriously turned up in the campus lost and found. No one knew who put it there, but all of her belongings were still intact inside. The police chased down every lead, but eventually the case went completely cold. In 1985, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a story about the unsolved cases that haunted detectives the most, and Debbie's was at the top of the list. The lead investigators admitted they believed it was a random attack and feared the killer would strike again. Fast forward to the spring of 1992. Debbie's murder had been languishing in a cold case file for 8 years. The case was finally assigned to a new cold case squad led by Detective Bob Snyder. Desperate for a breakthrough, Snyder decided to throw a Hail Mary. He took the entire case file to the Vidocq Society. This was a private, highly exclusive club of elite criminology experts who met once a month in Philadelphia to review unsolved cases. The members included top homicide detectives, prosecutors, defense attorneys, FBI agents, forensic scientists, and even an aeronautic physicist. During one of their closed-door meetings, Detective Snyder stood before the society and presented every detail of Debbie Wilson's murder. For several hours, the members of the society debated the details, but could not find a way forward. Then, a man named Richard Walter stood up. Walter was a founding member of the society and a world-renowned criminal psychologist who had spent his career profiling dangerous killers. Walter looked at the crime scene details and told the detectives that they had missed the most important clue in the entire case: Debbie's missing shoes and socks. The original investigators had assumed they had simply fallen off while her body was being dragged. But Walter argued that while shoes might fall off, socks almost never slide off completely during dragging. He proposed that the killer had deliberately taken her white Reebok sneakers and her socks as trophies. Walter believed the killer was a power-assertive, macho type of personality who possessed a severe pathological foot fetish. Detective Snyder was intrigued by this profile and decided to bring the theory back to his team. They began reopening the case and re-interviewing everyone involved. When they spoke to the former manager of the computer lab at Randall Hall, he mentioned a small detail that had always bothered him. He told the detectives that the high-speed printers in the basement lab were connected to a central university system that was programmed to automatically shut down at exactly 10 p.m. every single night. Therefore, there was absolutely no way anyone could have heard printers running in that lab in the middle of the night. When Detective Snyder heard this, he was stunned. He immediately remembered the statement of David Dixon, the pristine military veteran who had been ruled out as a suspect. Dixon had claimed that at 2:15 inches the morning, he had walked past the computer lab and decided not to check inside because he heard the loud sound of the printers running. If the printers shut off at 10 p.m., Dixon was lying. The detectives immediately began looking much more closely at David Dixon. They requested his complete military record from the Army, and when they looked at the very back of his file, they found a disciplinary report from 1979. The report stated that during his first year of service, Dixon had been arrested for breaking into another soldier's barracks locker. The only item he had stolen was a pair of dirty, used white Reebok sneakers. This was the exact type of shoe that Debbie was known to wear. The police then began tracking down Dixon's former and current neighbors. They interviewed several women who had lived next to him over the years. At least 4 of these women reported that their apartments had been broken into while they were away. But what was bizarre was that the intruder had ignored their cash, jewelry, and electronics. The only things that were ever stolen were their used white athletic shoes and their dirty socks. None of the women had ever been able to find out who was responsible, but they all lived right next door to David Dixon. Armed with this evidence, Detective Snyder obtained a search warrant for Dixon's apartment. When officers conducted the search, they opened his closet and found a disturbing collection. Tucked away in the back were 20 pairs of used women's white athletic shoes, each pair meticulously wrapped in individual plastic bags to preserve them as trophies. They also uncovered 77 homemade video cassettes. When they played the tapes, they found hours of footage that Dixon had secretly recorded of women's feet as they walked around the campus and the city, always focusing on their white shoes. The detectives then went to interview Dixon's ex-wife, who had been his girlfriend on the night of the murder. Dixon had claimed his alibi was that he had spent hours on the phone chatting with her, but when the detectives spoke to her, she completely shattered his story. She told them that they had only spoken for a couple of minutes that night, not hours. Dixon had lied to the police to cover up his whereabouts during the exact hours that Debbie was killed. In June of 1993, the police officially arrested David Dixon and charged him with the first-degree murder of Debbie Wilson. While he refused to speak to the detectives and maintained his innocence, he could not keep his mouth shut once he was placed in a jail cell. Dixon began bragging to his cellmate about the crime. He told him in graphic detail how he had snuck into the computer lab, confronted Debbie, and killed her because he wanted to have his way with her feet and take her shoes as a prize. The cellmate, completely disgusted, immediately reported the confession to the guards. At the trial, the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the stolen shoes, the videotapes, the broken alibi, and the cellmate's testimony. David Dixon was found guilty of the murder of Debbie Wilson and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The tragedy of Debbie's death left a deep, permanent scar on her family and the Drexel community. For nearly 10 years, her loved ones had to live with the agonizing pain of not knowing who had taken her away or why. Her dreams of graduating, playing her clarinet, and one day driving that Mercedes-Benz were stolen from her in an instant, all because of a predator's bizarre and deadly obsession. But because of the dedication of a relentless detective and the brilliant minds of the Vidocq Society, justice was finally served and a dangerous killer was taken off the streets forever. In this case, the truth was never hidden. It was simply overlooked. So, the next time something doesn't make sense, it might be worth asking, what small detail are we missing? Let me know what you think in the comments.